Chapter 6, Unit 6, Cities and Urban Land Use Patterns and Processes. 6.1, The Origin and Influence of Urbanization. Let's start with a question that might seem almost too simple. Why do cities exist? Not in the philosophical sense, but in the concrete, geographic sense that the AP exam is going to test you on. Cities don't just appear randomly on a map. They emerge from a very specific set of conditions, and understanding those conditions is the foundation of everything in Unit 6. What is urbanization, and why does it matter? Urbanization, in the precise College Board vocabulary you'll need for the exam, refers to the process by which an increasing proportion of a population comes to live in cities and urban areas. Notice that definition carefully. It's about proportion, not just raw numbers. A country's urban population can grow in absolute terms while its urbanization rate stays flat if the rural population grows just as fast. That distinction is an MCQ trap you will almost certainly encounter, so lock it in now. The global story of urbanization is one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. In 1800, only about 3% of the world's population lived in cities. Today, more than 55% does, and the United Nations projects that figure will climb past 68% by 2050. Think of it this way: for most of human history, cities were the exception. Now, for the first time ever, the city is the default human habitat. That shift is what this entire unit is about. Agricultural surplus and the birth of cities. To understand where cities came from, you need to think about what made them possible in the first place. Cities require people to live in dense concentrations, which means someone has to feed all those people who are not growing their own food. That requires an agricultural surplus, a concept you should already recognize from Unit 5 on agriculture. The agricultural revolution, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago in places like Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River Valley in China, gave certain populations the ability to produce more food than they needed for immediate survival. That surplus freed some people from farming entirely, allowing them to specialize in crafts, governance, religion, trade, and administration. Those specialists clustered together, and that clustering, driven by the efficiencies of proximity, is the origin of urban settlement. This is a crucial connection the AP exam loves to test. Urbanization is not just a Unit 6 topic. It ties directly back to Unit 5's discussion of the first agricultural revolution, subsistence versus commercial farming, and the von Thunen model of agricultural land use. If you see an FRQ asking you to explain the relationship between agricultural development and urban growth, you need to draw that direct causal chain. Surplus production enables specialization, specialization generates density, and density defines urban settlement. Site and situation. Why cities grow where they do. Once you understand why cities can exist, you need to understand why they exist in specific places. College Board wants you to distinguish between two terms that students constantly mix up: site and situation. Site refers to the physical characteristics of the land itself, the local geography. A site might be chosen because it offers a defensible hilltop, a natural harbor, a river crossing, or fresh water. Rome was built on hills overlooking the Tiber River. Manhattan's island geography made it both defensible and accessible by water. These are site advantages. Situation, by contrast, refers to a location's relationship to other places, its connectivity and regional context. A city might grow because it sits at the intersection of two trade routes, or because it lies between a resource-rich interior and a coastal port. Chicago's situation at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, connecting the Great Lakes waterway system to the interior rail network, explains its explosive growth in the 19th century far better than any feature of its local terrain. When the AP exam asks you to explain why a city grew to prominence, always ask yourself, is this a site advantage or a situation advantage? Most great cities have both, but they are conceptually distinct, and confusing them will cost you points. Levels of urbanization and the urban hierarchy. The AP exam expects you to think about urbanization not just as a process, but as something that varies enormously across space and time. More developed countries, or MDCs, generally have high urbanization rates, often above 75 to 80%. Less developed countries, or LDCs, tend to have lower rates overall. But here's the crucial wrinkle. Some of the fastest urbanization happening right now is in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. The most rapidly urbanizing regions are not the most developed ones. That's another common MCQ trap. Students assume high urbanization equals developed country, but the rate of change is actually highest in the global south. This leads directly to a concept you must understand precisely: over-urbanization. Over-urbanization occurs when cities grow faster than their infrastructure and economic base can support, leading to unemployment, inadequate housing, and overwhelmed services. This is different from suburbanization, which is urban growth pushing outward from a prosperous core. Over-urbanization produces vast informal settlements, called squatter settlements or slums, which you'll explore further in later sections. Do not confuse over-urbanization with urbanization itself. The exam distinguishes between healthy urban growth driven by economic opportunity and growth that outpaces a city's capacity to absorb it. Push and pull, factors driving urban migration. Cities grow because people move to them, and people move to them for reasons geographers categorize as push and pull factors, a framework you first encountered in Unit 2 on migration. Push factors drive people out of rural areas, agricultural mechanization reducing the need for farm labor, land consolidation, environmental degradation, or rural poverty. Pull factors draw people towards cities, employment opportunities, access to education and healthcare, infrastructure, and the social and cultural vibrancy of urban life. When you encounter an FRQ asking about urban growth in a developing country, always address both sides of this equation. A complete answer names specific push factors operating in the rural origin area and specific pull factors operating in the urban destination. Why this topic connects everything. What makes 6.1 so important is that it establishes the conceptual scaffolding for everything else in Unit 6. Every model you'll study, the concentric zone model, the sector model, the multiple nuclei model, the galactic city model, is trying to explain the internal structure of cities that already exist because of the forces you just learned about. Before you can understand how a city is organized, you need to understand why it formed, where it formed, and what forces keep drawing people into it. With that foundation firmly in place, let's zoom in from the broad sweep of urbanization as a global process and start examining how geographers and urban planners have tried to model and explain the internal structure and land use patterns of those cities, beginning with the classic models that anchor the College Board's expectations for Unit 6. 6.2 Cities across the world. Site and situation. Let's talk about something that seems almost too simple at first glance, why cities exist where they do. But I promise you, by the time we're done here, you're going to look at every city on a map differently. And more importantly, you're going to have the conceptual tools to answer some of the trickiest questions on the AP Human Geography exam. The core distinction: site versus situation. Here's the foundation. Every city can be understood through two lenses, and the College Board absolutely loves to test whether you know the difference between them. Site refers to the physical characteristics of the land on which a city is built, the actual, local geography of that specific spot. Think of it as the ground beneath your feet. Site includes things like the topography, whether the land is flat or hilly, the soil quality, the availability of fresh water, the defensibility of the terrain, and whether the land is prone to flooding. When you ask, what is this place made of, physically, you're asking about site, situation. On the other hand, is about a city's location relative to other places. It's the city's position in a broader geographic context, its relationship to trade routes, other cities, resources, markets, and transportation networks. When you ask, what does this place connect to, you're asking about situation. Here's an analogy that might stick with you. Imagine you're opening a coffee shop. The site is the actual building, its square footage, the parking lot, whether there's a drive-through window. The situation is whether you're on a busy commuter road, near a college campus, or sandwiched between a hospital and an office park. Both matter enormously, but they're fundamentally different kinds of considerations. Cities work the same way. Site, factors, and action. Let's ground this with real cities. San Francisco is a classic site example. The city sits on a peninsula with a naturally deep harbor, the San Francisco Bay, which made it an ideal site for a port city. But notice the trade-offs. That same hilly terrain makes construction expensive and challenging, and the location on the Pacific Ring of Fire means significant earthquake risk. Site is never purely advantageous, it always involves trade-offs. The AP exam will sometimes present a city with a strong site advantage alongside a disadvantage, and you need to recognize that both are part of the site analysis. New Orleans is another go-to site example, and it's particularly useful because its site is so problematic. The city sits below sea level in a delta environment surrounded by water, the Mississippi River to the south, Lake Pontchartrain to the north. Its site made it vulnerable to the catastrophic flooding you saw during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. This connects directly to Unit 5 content on environmental vulnerabilities and hazards, so remember that site factors aren't just historical, they have ongoing consequences for urban populations. Situation factors in action. Now let's talk situation. Chicago is the textbook situation city. Its physical site, flat land at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, is honestly unremarkable. What made Chicago explode into one of America's great cities was its situation. It sat at the convergence of Great Lakes water transport and the emerging railroad networks of the 19th century. It became the transfer point between the agricultural Midwest and the industrial East. Situation made Chicago. If you changed Chicago's situation, if the railroads had bypassed it, the physical site wouldn't have saved it. Singapore is another perfect situation example. The island city-state sits at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, right at the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes, connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. Its situation as a choke point on global trade routes made it indispensable. That's situational advantage operating at a world historical scale. How site and situation change over time. Here's something the AP exam will definitely probe. Site and situation are not static. A city's situation in particular can change dramatically as technology and trade patterns shift. This is critical. Detroit had a phenomenal situation in the early 20th century. It was centrally located relative to iron ore from Minnesota, coal from Pennsylvania, and the industrial markets of the Northeast. The automobile industry grew there for situational reasons. But as manufacturing shifted, as global competition emerged, as trade routes changed, Detroit's situational advantages eroded. This is a beautiful example of how situation is historically contingent. Similarly, consider how the railroad changed the situation of cities across the American interior. Towns that were bypassed by the railroad, towns with perfectly decent sites, often withered, while small rail junctions became booming cities almost overnight. The College Board loves questions that ask you to explain why a once important city declined. And changing situation is almost always part of the answer. Common MCQ traps to avoid. Let me be direct about the mistakes students make. The most common trap is confusing site and situation because both sound like they're about location. Remember this clearly. Site is internal. It's about the physical characteristics of the place itself. Situation is external. It's about relationships with other places. If a question describes a river, a harbor, a hill, or a natural resource at the city's location, that's site. If a question describes trade routes, proximity to other cities, or connections to markets, that's situation. Another trap. Students sometimes think situation is more important than site, or vice versa. The AP exam doesn't want you to rank them. It wants you to recognize that successful cities usually have both favorable site characteristics and favorable situation. When a question asks why a city formed at a particular location, look for evidence of both types of factors and be precise about which is which. Watch out also for questions that describe a city's situation as if it's a fixed feature. Always be alert to temporal framing. A city's situation circa 1800 might be completely different from its situation today, and exam questions sometimes test this by describing historical development and asking you to apply the right concept. Connections to other units. This topic is deeply woven into the rest of the course. From Unit 1, you need your understanding of geographic scale. Site operates at the local scale. Situation operates at the regional or global scale. From Unit 2 and 3, population distribution and cultural patterns help explain why certain situations became more valuable over time. From Unit 7 on industrialization, you'll see how economic shifts reshaped urban situations across the industrial world. And in later sections of Unit 6, site and situation feed directly into why cities develop the internal land use patterns they do. A city constrained by its site, like San Francisco on its peninsula, will develop differently than a city with unlimited flat land. Understanding site and situation is really understanding the origin story of cities, and that origin story shapes everything that comes after, which is exactly what we'll explore as we move into the models and patterns of urban land use in the sections ahead. 6.3 Cities and Globalization. World Cities and Global Cities, Generation Failed. 6.4 The Gravity Model in Urban Geography. What the gravity model actually is. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're standing in a small town somewhere in rural Ohio, and you're trying to decide where to go shopping this weekend. There's a tiny strip mall 10 minutes away, a medium-sized city about 40 minutes away, and a massive metropolitan area about an hour and a half away. Which one pulls you in? The answer isn't just about distance, it's about size, too. That intuition you have, that mix of how big is it and how far away is it, is exactly what the gravity model tries to capture mathematically. The gravity model in urban geography is borrowed directly from Newton's law of universal gravitation in physics. Newton said that the gravitational force between two objects is proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the distance between them. Geographers took that idea and said cities work the same way. The interaction between two places, the flow of people, goods, information, migration, commuting, trade, increases as the size of those places increases, and decreases as the distance between them increases. The formula you must know cold. Here is the gravity model formula as the College Board expects you to know it. Interaction I equals population of city A times population of city B divided by distance squared, or written more formally, I equals PA times PB divided D squared. Let's walk through this carefully because the exam will absolutely test your ability to apply it. Say city A has a population of 500,000, city B has a population of 200,000, and the distance between them is 100 kilometers. You'd multiply 500,000 by 200,000 to get 100 million. That's your numerator. Then you square the distance. 100 squared is 10,000. Divide the numerator by 10,000 and your interaction score is 10 million. Now here's the critical thing. That number by itself means almost nothing in isolation. The gravity model is most useful as a comparative tool. You calculate interaction scores for multiple city pairs and compare them. A higher score means more predicted interaction, more commuting, more trade, more migration, more cultural exchange. Why distance is squared, and why that matters. Pay close attention to the exponent on distance, because this is where the exam likes to hide traps. Distance is squared in the denominator, which means that distance has a disproportionately large dampening effect on interaction. If the distance between two cities doubles, the predicted interaction doesn't just cut in half, it drops to 1/4. This reflects the concept of distance decay, which you should already know from earlier in this course. Distance decay says that as distance increases, interaction decreases, and it does so rapidly and nonlinearly. Think of it like a phone signal. Move a little further from the tower and you lose a lot of signal, not a little. Some versions of the gravity model use a distance exponent other than 2, sometimes 1, sometimes 3, depending on what kind of interaction is being modeled. For the AP exam, unless you're told otherwise, assume the exponent is 2. This is one of those boundary conditions that trips up students who overthink it. The concept of intervening opportunity. Here's where things get nuanced, and this nuance shows up on the exam. The gravity model in its pure form doesn't account for what's between the two cities. That's where the concept of intervening opportunity comes in. An intervening opportunity is simply a closer alternative destination that reduces the likelihood of interaction with a more distant place. Going back to our Ohio shopping example, if a brand new outlet mall opens up just 20 minutes from your small town, your likelihood of making the 90-minute drive to the big city drops dramatically, even though the big city hasn't changed at all. The gravity model predicts interaction based only on size and distance. But intervening opportunities explain why real-world patterns often diverge from the model's prediction. On the AP exam, if you see a scenario where the gravity model predicts high interaction, but actual observed interaction is lower than expected, your first thought should be, is there an intervening opportunity? Drawing and interpreting the model. The exam may ask you to interpret or sketch a diagram illustrating the gravity model concept. Picture two circles of different sizes. City A is much larger, City B is smaller. Draw an arrow between them. The thickness of that arrow represents the predicted interaction. Now place a medium-sized city directly between them. Closer to City B, label it City C. Your diagram should show that the arrow between A and B gets thinner, because City C serves as an intervening opportunity for people in City B who might otherwise travel to City A. Meanwhile, you can draw a thick arrow between A and C because A is large and C is nearby. This visual captures both the gravity model logic and the intervening opportunity concept in one picture, exactly the kind of synthesis the FRQ rubric rewards. Common traps and misconceptions. The most common wrong answer trap on gravity model MCQs is forgetting to square the distance. Students will divide by distance once and get a much larger interaction score than is correct, leading them to choose the wrong comparison. Always square it. A second trap involves confusing the gravity model with central place theory. Central place theory, which you covered in 6.3, explains the size and spacing of cities in a hierarchical system. The gravity model predicts interaction between specific city pairs. They are complementary ideas, but they answer different questions. Central place theory asks, how are cities distributed? The gravity model asks, how much do two cities interact? A third misconception is treating the gravity model as a perfect predictor. The College Board wants you to know its limitations. The model doesn't account for political boundaries, cultural ties, transportation infrastructure quality, language barriers, or critically intervening opportunities. When an FRQ asks you to evaluate the model, always acknowledge both its utility and its limitations. Connections across the course. The gravity model ties directly into several other AP human geography topics. In Unit 2, Population and Migration, You can apply it to migration flows. Larger origin and destination cities with shorter distances between them will have more predicted migration. In Unit 5, Agriculture and Rural Land Use, the model helps explain market area analysis and how farmers choose where to sell goods. And in Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Development, it underpins trade flow analysis between urban centers. Understanding the gravity model also reinforces the broader theme that runs through all of Unit 6. Cities don't exist in isolation. They pull on each other, they compete for residents and commerce, and the patterns we see in urban landscapes are the result of measurable forces, not random chance. As you move forward, you'll see how these ideas about urban interaction and influence help explain the next concept: how cities divide their internal space, and why certain land uses cluster where they do. 6.5 Urban Land Use. Concentric Zone Model, Burgess. Setting the stage, why cities look the way they do. Imagine you're standing in the dead center of Chicago in the 1920s, the smell of industry in the air, factories humming, immigrants packed into tenement apartments just a few blocks from the financial district. Now picture yourself slowly walking outward, block by block, mile by mile, watching the landscape change almost like rings on a tree. That image, that walk, is essentially what sociologist Ernest Burgess was describing in 1925, when he proposed one of the most important urban models you'll encounter on the AP Human Geography exam, the concentric zone model. Burgess wasn't just drawing circles for fun. He was trying to answer a fundamental geographic question: why do cities organize themselves the way they do? His answer was rooted in the process of invasion and succession, the idea that as new immigrant groups or land uses move into a city, they push previous residents outward, creating distinct rings or zones radiating from the city center. Think of it like a stone dropped in a pond. The ripple closest to the stone feels the most energy, and each successive wave moves outward with less intensity. In urban terms, that energy is economic pressure, and the ripples are rings of different land uses. Drawing and labeling the model. Here's where you need to be precise, because the AP exam absolutely will ask you to identify, label, or interpret a diagram of this model. Picture 5 concentric circles like a bullseye target, each one nested inside the next. The innermost circle is the Central Business District, or CBD. This is the core, the high-rises, the banks, the department stores, the government buildings. Land values are highest here because everyone wants to be at the center of accessibility. On the exam, the CBD is almost always Zone 1, and you should associate it with the highest land value, the most commercial activity, and virtually zero residential population. People work there, but almost nobody actually lives there. The second ring is called the zone in transition, sometimes labeled the zone of transition. This is critically important for the exam. This zone is where industry and deteriorating housing mix uncomfortably together. It's where factories once clustered near the railroad yards and where the poorest and most recent immigrants historically settled because the rent was cheapest. In Burgess's Chicago, this was the domain of first-generation Eastern European immigrants and later African American migrants arriving from the South during the Great Migration. The housing stock here is old, often subdivided into crowded tenements, and the area is described geographically as having the lowest housing quality in the model. Don't confuse lowest land value with lowest housing quality. Land in the zone in transition actually has speculative value because developers know the CBD might expand into it, driving prices up even as the buildings themselves deteriorate. The third ring is the zone of working-class homes, where second-generation immigrants, those who've earned enough to escape the transition zone, settle. The housing is modest but stable. Think small bungalows and 2 flats. These are blue-collar workers who still need to commute easily to factory jobs closer to the center. The fourth ring is the zone of better residences, sometimes called the zone of middle-class homes. Here you find larger single-family homes, apartment buildings for professionals, and the beginnings of the suburbs as Burgess's contemporaries understood them. This is the middle class making its geographic statement. The outermost ring, Zone 5, is the commuter zone, the early suburbs and satellite cities that exist beyond the continuous urban fabric. These residents have the longest commutes, but also the largest homes and the most separation from urban density. Burgess recognized that transportation, specifically the railroads and early automobiles of the 1920s, made this zone possible. The underlying logic, bid-rent theory. Burgess's model doesn't exist in isolation. It's inseparable from bid-rent theory, which explains why different users cluster in different zones. The idea is straightforward. Different users, commercial, industrial, residential, are willing to pay different amounts for land depending on how close it is to the center. Commercial users bid the highest for central land because they need foot traffic and accessibility. As you move outward, commercial users drop out. Industrial users occupy the next ring. They need cheap land, but still want reasonable access. And residential users fill the outer zones where land is cheapest. When you graph bid rent theory, you draw three downward sloping curves on axes of rent, vertical, and distance from CBD horizontal, with the commercial curve steepest and the residential curve flattest. Where the curves intersect, you see the boundaries between land use zones, and those intersections correspond directly to the boundaries between Burgess's rings. Common exam traps and misconceptions. Here's where a lot of students lose points. The single biggest trap is assuming the concentric zone model is universal. Burgess built this model around Chicago, which developed during the industrial era with a strong radial rail network. The College Board expects you to know its limitations. The model assumes a flat, featureless plain, no rivers, no mountains, a single central core, and movement driven purely by economic filtering. Real cities deviate constantly. Chicago itself has Lake Michigan cutting off half the rings to the east. Most non-American cities, particularly those in the developing world, follow entirely different models, and this is where your connections to Unit 6's other models become crucial. You should also avoid confusing the zone in transition with the area of lowest land value. And don't mix up Burgess with the other two models you'll study: the sector model, Hoyt, and the multiple nuclei model, Harris and Ullman. A common wrong answer trap asks which model shows multiple CBDs. That's Harris and Ullman, not Burgess. Burgess always has one center. Another exam trap: students sometimes say the poorest residents live farthest from the center. In the concentric zone model, it's the opposite. The poor live closest to the center, in the zone in transition, while wealth increases with distance. This is the pattern for industrial-era American cities, and it's the reverse of what you often see in cities in the Global South, which follow the Latin American city model where elites cluster near the center. Connections to the broader course. The concentric zone model threads through multiple parts of your AP course. In Unit 5, Agriculture, you saw von Thunen's model of agricultural land use radiating from a central market. Burgess is essentially applying the same concentric logic to the urban scale. In Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Development, the concept of filtering connects directly here. As housing ages and wealthy residents move outward, older units filter down to lower income groups, a process central to understanding urban inequality and gentrification. And when you reach topics like urban renewal, redlining, and suburbanization, you're really watching Burgess's zones being disrupted, reinforced, or deliberately restructured by policy. With Burgess's concentric rings now firmly drawn in your mind, let's move outward in our thinking to explore how Hoyt's sector model challenged these neat circles and introduce the idea that cities grow in wedges rather than rings. 6-stat sector model, Hoyt, and multiple nuclei model, Harris and Ullman. Why the concentric zone model wasn't enough. All right, let's pick up right where Burgess left us. You'll remember that the concentric zone model gave us a beautiful, clean set of rings radiating outward from a central business district. Tidy, symmetrical, almost too perfect. And that's exactly the problem. Real cities aren't perfect circles. They're messy, asymmetrical, and shaped by rivers, railroads, highways, history, and 1,000 other forces. Two models emerged to fix what Burgess got wrong, and both are absolutely essential for your AP exam. So grab your coffee, because we're going deep on Homer Hoyt's sector model and the multiple nuclei model from Harris and Ullman. The sector model. Cities grow in wedges, not rings. Homer Hoyt published his model in 1939 after studying rent patterns in 142 American cities, and his central insight was this: once a land use establishes itself along a transportation corridor, a rail line, a major road, a streetcar route, it tends to grow outward from the CBD in that same direction, forming a wedge or sector, not a ring. Think of a pie. Burgess gave you layers of a cake. Hoyt gave you slices of pie. Here's the analogy that makes this stick. Imagine you're standing downtown and you notice that all the fancy department stores and high-end boutiques are located along one particular boulevard heading northwest. According to Hoyt, as the city expands, high-income residential neighborhoods are going to follow that same northwest corridor outward, staying close to those amenities and away from industrial zones. Wealthy people, Hoyt argued, drive the model. High-rent districts establish their corridor early, and everything else arranges around them. When you draw this model for the AP exam, start with a central circle for the CBD. Then draw irregular wedge shapes radiating outward from that center like pie slices, but make them unequal and irregular because that's the point. Label one wedge as high-income residential, and place it adjacent to another wedge of medium-income residential. Low-income residential, in Hoyt's model, tends to cluster near industrial sectors, which are typically located along rail lines or waterfronts. The key visual difference from Burgess is that zones are elongated and directional rather than concentric and symmetrical. The most common MCQ trap here is conflating Hoyt with Burgess. The exam will describe a city where wealthy neighborhoods are clustered along a highway corridor rather than forming an outer ring, and ask you which model best explains the pattern. The answer is Hoyt. The signal words are wedge, sector, corridor, transportation route, and directional growth. If you see those, think Hoyt. Also know that Hoyt's model was built on American cities in the early 20th century with significant streetcar and rail infrastructure. It explains why, even today, you'll often find that a city's wealthiest neighborhoods are clustered along one or two specific axes, like Chicago's North Shore along Lake Michigan, or the west side of Los Angeles following Wilshire Boulevard. These aren't accidents, they're Hoyt sectors playing out in real life. The multiple nuclei model. Cities as galaxies, not solar systems. Now let's move to 1945, when geographers Chauncey Harris and Edward Ullman looked at the same messy urban reality and said something even more radical. Cities don't have just one center, they have multiple. The multiple nuclei model proposes that a city develops around several distinct nodes of activity, each of which attracts specific land uses based on their own logic and repels others. The solar system analogy breaks down here, and that's intentional. Instead of everything orbiting one sun, the CBD, think of a galaxy with multiple stars. You might have a traditional CBD, but alongside it you'll also find separate nodes, an airport zone, a university district, a suburban shopping center, an industrial park near a port, a medical complex. Each of these nuclei generates its own surrounding land uses, and together they create a patchwork urban landscape that looks nothing like concentric rings or clean pie slices. Harris and Ullman identified 4 reasons why distinct nuclei form and why certain activities cluster together while others repel each other. First, some activities require specialized facilities, a port, an airport, a rail yard, and must locate near them. Second, similar activities benefit from clustering, a concept called agglomeration. Retail stores want to be near other retail stores because proximity draws more customers. Third, some activities are mutually incompatible. A luxury residential neighborhood and a heavy manufacturing plant simply don't coexist peacefully. And fourth, some activities can't afford high-rent locations and are pushed to cheaper peripheral zones. You don't need to recite these as a numbered list on the exam, but you absolutely need to understand the logic, because FRQ questions will ask you to explain why a specific land use is located where it is. When drawing this model, forget symmetry entirely, sketch an irregular urban boundary. Inside it, draw several separate labeled circles or nodes: CBD, wholesale light manufacturing, low-income residential, medium-income residential, high-income residential, heavy manufacturing, outlying business district, residential suburb, and industrial suburb. The arrangement should look somewhat random and decentralized because that's the entire point. Cities like Los Angeles are the textbook example here. LA doesn't have one dominant core. It has Hollywood, downtown LA, Century City, the port at San Pedro, LAX's surrounding commercial zone, and so on. That's multiple nuclei in action. Edge, cases, traps, and connections you must know. Here's where students lose points on MCQs. All 3 urban models, Burgess, Hoyt, and Harris-Ullman, assume a free market economy, and they were developed primarily to describe North American and Western European cities. On the AP exam, when a question describes cities in Latin America, Southeast Asia, or Sub-Saharan Africa, you should not reach for these models first. That's when you need the Latin American city model or other region-specific models covered later in Unit 6. Another trap. Students sometimes assume the multiple nuclei model replaced the other 2. It didn't. On the exam, a city might exhibit characteristics of more than one model simultaneously, and a question might ask you to identify which model best explains a specific feature rather than the whole city. Read carefully and match the specific described pattern to the right model. This topic connects directly back to Unit 6's broader themes of suburbanization, edge cities, and urban sprawl. Edge cities, those large suburban nodes of commercial and office development that emerged along interstate highways, are essentially the nuclei of Harris and Ullman's model expressing themselves in a contemporary landscape. When you encounter questions about edge cities or boom burbs later in Unit 6, remember that the theoretical foundation is sitting right here in the multiple nuclei model. You'll also want to connect this to Unit 7's discussion of economic development. The logic of agglomeration, why similar industries cluster, underlies both urban land use patterns and regional economic geography. Silicon Valley and Detroit's automotive legacy are agglomeration at a regional scale, operating by the same basic logic as the nuclei in Harris and Ullman's model. With these 3 urban land use models now firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to start applying them to the forces that have physically reshaped American cities over the last century, beginning with suburbanization and the infrastructure decisions that made it possible. 6.7 urban models for Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Why these models exist and why they matter. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. When we studied the Burgess concentric zone model and the Hoyt sector model back in Unit 6, those were built entirely on observations of American and European cities, places like Chicago, where land is bought and sold in open markets, where industrialization created factory rings, and where the wealthy fled outward toward the suburbs. But if you drop those models onto São Paulo, or Manila, or Lagos, they don't really fit. The geography is different, the colonial history is different, the economic forces are different. So scholars developed new models, specifically for cities in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. On the AP exam, your job is to know all 3 of these regional models, be able to describe and sketch each one and explain why each city looks the way it does. Let's build that understanding together. The Latin American city model, Griffin-Ford model. Imagine a city where the wealthiest residents don't flee to the suburbs. Instead, they live right in the middle, close to power, commerce, and culture. That's your first clue that Latin American cities work differently. The Griffin-Ford model, developed by Ernst Griffin and Larry Ford, is the one you need to know here. Picture the model as a series of concentric rings, but with a twist. At the very center is the CBD, the Central Business District, which in Latin American cities tends to be vibrant, formal, and well-maintained, often blending colonial-era plazas with modern commercial towers. Radiating outward from the CBD is a spine of elite residential development called the commercial spine, or elite residential spine. Think of it like a spoke on a wheel, except this spoke is lined with luxury housing, high-end shops, and good infrastructure. This spine often follows a boulevard built during the colonial period and extended during modernization. Wealthy families live along this spine, close to commerce and services. Moving outward from the CBD in all other directions, you encounter a zone of maturity, older, stable, working-class and middle-class neighborhoods with decent infrastructure. Beyond that is a zone of in situ accretion, where neighborhoods are transitional. Some homes are solid, some are still being built up by families over time using whatever materials are available. Finally, at the outer edge, you find the zone of peripheral squatter settlements, sometimes called favelas in Brazil or colonias in Mexico. This is the crucial reversal from the American model. In Latin American cities, poverty is concentrated on the periphery, not near the center. Wealthy residents don't suburbanize. They stay close to the CBD. The urban poor are pushed outward, often onto steep hillsides or flood-prone land with poor road access and limited services. On the AP exam, the most common trap here is confusing this model with Burgess. In Burgess, the urban poor live in the zone of transition near the center, while the wealthy live in the outer rings. In Griffin-Ford, it's reversed. If an FRQ asks you to compare the two, that reversal is almost certainly worth a rubric point. The Southeast Asian City Model, McGee Model. Terry McGee's model for Southeast Asian cities reflects a completely different historical and economic story. These cities, think of Bangkok, Jakarta, or Manila, were shaped heavily by colonialism, but also by the persistence of informal market systems and the cultural importance of ethnic enclaves. In the McGee model, you don't have a single dominant CBD. Instead, there are multiple commercial zones. The colonial CBD represents the area developed by European colonizers, typically featuring government buildings and formal commerce. Nearby, but distinct, is a Chinese commercial zone, because in much of Southeast Asia, ethnic Chinese merchants historically dominated retail trade. There's also often an alien commercial zone, representing other immigrant merchant groups. At the port or waterfront, you'll find the port zone because many Southeast Asian cities grew as colonial trading hubs, and that maritime orientation is baked into the urban fabric. Surrounding and weaving through all of this are kampongs, traditional village-style neighborhoods that got absorbed into the expanding city. The urban poor often live in these dense, informal kampong areas, and the transition between formal and informal is blurry. There are also new suburban zones on the periphery for the growing middle class. The key conceptual insight for the exam: Southeast Asian cities lack the neat concentric ring structure of Western models. They're polycentric and fragmented, with multiple commercial zones reflecting ethnic, colonial, and indigenous histories layered on top of each other. If an MCQ asks why a Southeast Asian city doesn't fit the Burgess model, the answer involves both colonial history and the role of ethnic commercial districts. The Sub-Saharan African City Model, Diblige Model. Cities in Sub-Saharan Africa: Nairobi, Lagos, Johannesburg, Dakar, carry the most visible scars of colonialism. The de Blege model, named for geographer Harm de Blege, captures this clearly. The model shows three CBDs coexisting in tension. There's a colonial CBD, which was built by and for European settlers, often with wide boulevards and formal commercial architecture. Adjacent to this is an informal or traditional market zone, where indigenous African commerce has always happened, and there's often a mixed-use zone in between. Outside these central areas, you find townships, formally segregated residential zones established under colonial, and in South Africa's case, apartheid policy to house Black African workers away from white-occupied areas. Townships are typically located on the periphery and have historically lacked adequate infrastructure. Beyond the townships, at the outermost edge, are squatter settlements of the most recent rural to urban migrants. The AP exam loves to ask about the dual legacy of colonialism in sub-Saharan African cities, the formal colonial city and the informal indigenous city operating side by side. Another frequent point: the presence of mining operations or export processing zones near sub-Saharan African cities, which reflects the extractive colonial economy that shaped urban geography in this region. Connecting to the bigger picture, all three of these models connect to Unit 6's broader themes of urban land use and to Unit 7's themes of industrialization and economic development. They also tie into Unit 4's discussion of colonialism. You simply cannot explain why Lagos or Jakarta looks the way it does without invoking the colonial past. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain urban inequality or the growth of informal settlements, these models give you the geographic vocabulary and the historical framework to earn full credit. Coming up next, you'll explore how cities around the world are changing in the present, urban renewal, gentrification, and the forces reshaping these urban landscapes today. 6.8 The Galactic City Model and Edge Cities. Setting the scene, beyond the traditional city. Picture the classic American city you probably studied earlier in this unit, the concentric zone model, the sector model, the multiple nuclei model. All of those frameworks imagined the downtown core as the beating heart of urban life, the place where everything important happened. Workers commuted toward the center in the morning and fled back to the suburbs at night. The city radiated outward from a single dominant point. That mental image made perfect sense for Chicago in 1925 or New York in 1950. But take a look at Atlanta, Dallas, or Los Angeles today, and something feels fundamentally different. The old models start to crack. That's exactly where the Galactic City model and the concept of edge cities step in, and for the AP exam, you need to understand both with real precision. The Galactic City model. The Galactic City model, developed by urban geographer Chauncey Harris in 1997, is the most contemporary urban land use model you'll encounter in AP Human Geography. Harris, yes, the same Harris who co-created the multiple nuclei model back in 1945, updated his thinking to reflect what American and global cities actually looked like by the late 20th century. The core insight is this: urban growth is no longer organized around a single dominant center. Instead, it's scattered, sprawling, and decentralized, like a galaxy where multiple bright clusters of activity float in a sea of lower density development. That's where the name comes from. In the Galactic City model, the traditional central business district still exists, but it has lost its monopoly on economic and social activity. Surrounding it are edge cities, those clusters of intense commercial, retail, and office development located on the suburban fringe, usually near major highway interchanges. Then further out you have areas of even lower density suburban sprawl, exurbs, master-planned communities, and isolated pockets of activity that seem to have no relationship to any center at all. The whole system is held together not by a streetcar network pointing toward downtown, but by the highway and interstate system, and increasingly personal automobile dependency. If you think about suburban Atlanta Buckhead, Perimeter Center, Gwinnett County, you're seeing the Galactic City in action. Edge cities, definition and characteristics. The term edge city was popularized by journalist Joel Garreau in his 1991 book, Edge City: Life on the New Frontier, and College Board loves this concept for both MCQs and FRQs. Garreau gave edge cities a precise definition that you should be able to recall. An edge city must have at least 5 million square feet of leasable office space, at least 600,000 square feet of leasable retail space, roughly the size of a large regional mall, more jobs than bedrooms, and it must be perceived by the population as a single destination. Critically, it must have been essentially nothing like a city 30 years before, meaning it rose from the suburban landscape within living memory. The real-world examples are everywhere, once you know what to look for. Tyson's Corner in Northern Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., is the textbook case. It was farmland into the 1960s and is now one of the largest office markets on the East Coast. Schaumburg, Illinois, outside Chicago, fits this profile too. So does the Galleria area of Houston. These places feel like cities. They have traffic, skyscrapers, hotels, shopping, and corporate headquarters, but they exist entirely within what used to be the suburban ring, not in or near any traditional downtown. Why edge cities form, the forces behind decentralization. To really understand this for the exam, you need to connect edge cities back to the push and pull factors of suburbanization from earlier in Unit 6. The forces that pushed people out of the urban core, crime, high land costs, congestion, declining school quality, also pushed businesses out. When enough suburbanites live in the same peripheral area, it becomes economically rational to locate offices, malls, and entertainment there rather than pay downtown prices. Highway construction, particularly the interstate highway system authorized in 1956, made these peripheral locations genuinely accessible. Add in cheap land, favorable tax structures in suburban municipalities, and the rise of the automobile as the primary mode of transportation, and you have a perfect recipe for edge city formation. This also connects directly to the concept of decentralization and counter-urbanization that you studied earlier. Edge cities are, in a sense, the economic infrastructure of the suburban lifestyle. They allow people to live, work, shop, and play entirely within the suburban ring, never needing to touch the old downtown at all. Boomburbs and exurbs, the outer edge. The AP exam also wants you to distinguish edge cities from two related concepts. Boomburbs are rapidly growing suburban cities, places like Mesa, Arizona, or Henderson, Nevada, that have large populations but low density and are functionally suburban even if they are technically incorporated cities. They grow fast, they sprawl, and they lack the dense urban fabric of traditional cities. Exurbs, on the other hand, are even further out, beyond the suburbs, in areas that are semi-rural but still connected to the metropolitan economy by long car commutes. Residents of exurbs often live on larger lots, enjoy a rural aesthetic, but still depend on urban and suburban employment centers. The galactic city model encompasses all of these zones: the old downtown, the inner suburbs, the edge cities, the boomburbs, and the exurbs, as part of one loosely organized, car-dependent metropolitan system. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. Here's where students consistently lose points. The most common trap is confusing the multiple nuclei model with the galactic city model. Both involve multiple centers of activity, so they look similar at first glance. The crucial difference is that the multiple nuclei model still implies relatively fixed, historically rooted nuclei in an established urban form, while the galactic city model reflects post-1970s decentralization, automobile dependency, and the rise of edge cities from formerly suburban or rural land. If an exam question mentions highways, SUVs, suburban office parks, or the late 20th century, your instinct should immediately shift toward the galactic city model. Another trap: students sometimes forget that edge cities are not the same as suburbs. Suburbs are primarily residential. Edge cities are primarily commercial and employment-focused. They have more jobs than bedrooms, which is Garreau's key distinguishing criterion. If an FRQ asks you to explain what makes a location an edge city, that jobs-to-bedrooms ratio is a rubric point you cannot afford to skip. Finally, connect this topic to Unit 7, Industrial and Economic Geography, by noting that the rise of edge cities reflects the shift to a service-based, post-industrial economy. Manufacturing left the urban core first. Now even corporate headquarters, law firms, and tech companies are choosing suburban campuses over downtown towers. Wrapping up and looking ahead. The galactic city model and edge cities represent the cutting edge of how geographers think about modern metropolitan space, scattered, decentralized, and driven by the car and the highway interchange. With that framework in your mind, you're perfectly positioned to tackle the next dimension of urban geography, the very human forces of urban renewal, gentrification, and the challenges of managing growth in these sprawling landscapes. 6.9 Central Place Theory, Christaller, Hexagonal Hinterlands and Market Areas. The big idea: why cities are where they are. Imagine you're standing in the middle of a flat, featureless plain, no mountains, no rivers, no coastlines, just perfectly uniform land stretching to the horizon in every direction. Where would towns and cities form? More importantly, how far apart would they be, and why would some grow larger than others? That thought experiment is exactly where Walter Christaller started in 1933, and the theory he built from it is one of the most tested and most misunderstood concepts on the AP Human Geography exam. Let's make sure you walk into the test owning it completely. The core vocabulary you cannot afford to get wrong. Central place theory explains the size, number, and spacing of human settlements based on their function as service providers. A central place is any settlement, a hamlet, a town, a city that provides goods and services to the surrounding population. The area that a central place serves is called its hinterland, also called its market area or complementary region. Think of the hinterland as the gravitational pull zone of a city. Every farm, village, and suburb within it looks to that central place for shopping, healthcare, legal services, and entertainment. Two concepts sit at the absolute heart of this theory: range and threshold. The range of a good is the maximum distance a consumer is willing to travel to purchase that good or service. You'll drive 45 minutes to an IKEA, but you won't drive 45 minutes to buy a gallon of milk. That difference in willingness to travel is range. The threshold is the minimum number of customers a business needs to be profitable, the minimum market size required to support that good or service. A neurosurgeon needs a massive threshold population. A convenience store does not. For the AP exam, remember this decision rule. A good or service will locate in a central place only if the threshold population exists within the range. If range exceeds threshold, the business survives. If threshold exceeds range, meaning you can't attract enough people before they stop wanting to travel, the business fails. The hexagonal model, drawing it and reading it. Here's where the geometry gets beautiful and where the AP exam loves to test you visually. Kristaller recognized a mathematical problem. If every central place has a circular market area, circles cannot tile a plane without either overlapping or leaving gaps. Overlap means consumers in the overlap zone are being served by two towns simultaneously, economically irrational. Gaps mean some consumers have no access to services, also impossible in a functioning economy. The solution? Hexagons. Hexagons are the most efficient shape for tiling a plane with no gaps and no overlaps, which is why you also see them in honeycomb structures. Nature solved the same problem. When the AP exam asks you to draw or interpret the central place theory diagram, here's exactly what you need to produce. Start with a central dot representing the largest, highest order city. Around it, draw 6 equally spaced dots at the corners of a regular hexagon. These are medium-sized towns. Each of those towns is then surrounded by its own ring of smaller settlements, again at hexagonal corners. The result is a nested, hierarchical lattice of hexagons within hexagons. Each central place is at the center of its own hexagon-shaped hinterland. Label the largest city with the most services, the medium towns with moderate services, and the smallest settlements called hamlets or low-order central places with only basic goods. The key rule for labeling: higher-order places have larger thresholds, greater ranges, more goods and services, fewer total settlements, and greater spacing between them. Lower-order places are the opposite: small thresholds, short ranges, limited services, many settlements, closely spaced. The 3 K values, the detail that separates a 4 from a 5. This is the concept most students either skip or memorize robotically without understanding. Kristaller described 3 different organizational principles, each producing a different geometric arrangement, identified by what he called K values, the number of lower-order settlements served by each higher-order place. In the marketing principle K equals 3, the goal is minimizing travel distance for consumers. Each lower-order town sits at the corner of 3 hexagons, so its market is split 3 ways. Each higher-order center, therefore, serves the equivalent of 1 full lower-order center, plus 1/3 of each of 6 surrounding lower-order centers, which gives you 1 plus 6 times as 3 equals 3, so each step up the hierarchy serves 3 times as many settlements. In the transportation principle K equals 4, the goal is efficient road or trade route networks. Lower-order places are positioned at the midpoints of the edges of the higher-order hexagon rather than at corners, meaning they're split between 2 centers. Each higher-order place serves 1 plus 6.5 equals 4 lower-order equivalents. In the administrative principle K equals 7, the goal is clean political control. A higher-order center must have complete administrative authority over all lower-order places with no shared jurisdiction. Lower-order centers fall entirely within 1 higher-order hexagon, giving 1 plus 6 and 1 equals 7. For the AP exam, K equals 3 is the most commonly tested K value and represents the default marketing arrangement. If a free response question mentions trade or market efficiency, go with K equals 3. If it mentions transportation networks or roads, think K equals 4, political or administrative control. K equals 7. Common MCQ traps and how to avoid them. The exam loves to ask which of 2 towns is higher order. Remember, the higher order place has fewer competitors, larger spacing, and more specialized services. Don't confuse population size with order. a high-order function can exist in a smaller city if that city serves a vast rural hinterland. The exam also frequently asks what happens when a new highway is built. Range increases because travel time drops, which can elevate a town's order. Watch for questions about isotropic planes, which is the AP term for that uniform, flat surface Christaller assumed. The theory breaks down in the real world because terrain, cultural factors, and historical accident disrupt the perfect hexagonal pattern, but Christaller's model remains the ideal type against which real patterns are measured. Connections to the rest of the course. Central place theory doesn't live in isolation on the exam. It connects directly to Unit 6's gravity model, and bin rent theory, range, and threshold are essentially geographic expressions of supply and demand in space. It links to Unit 7's development concepts because less developed regions often lack the threshold populations to support higher-order services, reinforcing economic inequality. It also relates to Unit 4's diffusion patterns, since the hierarchical diffusion of ideas, diseases, and innovations follows the same top-down urban hierarchy that Christaller mapped. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain why certain services cluster in large cities or why rural areas lack specialists, central place theory is almost always part of your answer. With Christaller's hexagons firmly in your mental map, you're ready to explore how the internal structure of cities is organized. Because once we know why cities form where they do, the next question is, what happens inside them? Which is exactly where models of urban land use and the bin rent theory take over. 6.10 Urban Hierarchy. Primate cities. Rank size rule. Setting the stage. Why do cities come in different sizes? Picture a solar system. You've got one enormous sun, a few medium-sized planets, and then a whole swarm of smaller moons and asteroids orbiting around them. Urban systems work in a surprisingly similar way. Countries tend to have one or a few dominant cities, surrounded by progressively smaller urban centers, each serving a different role in the overall network. That's exactly what this section is about, how geographers make sense of the structure of urban systems, using two essential frameworks, the rank size rule and the concept of primate cities, master both, and you'll have a powerful lens for reading the urban landscape anywhere on Earth. The rank size rule. Math meets geography. Let's start with the rank size rule developed most fully by geographer George Zipf in the mid-20th century. The rule gives you a predictable mathematical relationship between a city's rank, its position in the population hierarchy, and its population size. The formula looks like this. The population of a city of rank n equals the population of the largest city divided by n, written out. That's population of city n equals population of city 1 divided by n, so imagine the largest city in a country has 8 million people. According to the rank size rule, the second largest city should have 8 million divided by 2, or 4 million. The third largest should have about 2.67 million, the fourth, 2 million, and so on down the line. The AP exam absolutely loves to give you a table of city populations and ask you to determine whether a country follows the rank size rule, so practice plugging numbers into that formula until it feels automatic. Here's how to visualize this on a graph, because the AP exam may ask you to interpret or sketch one. When you plot city rank on the horizontal axis and city population on the vertical axis using a regular linear scale, you get a steep curve that drops off quickly like a ski slope. But geographers almost always use a log-log scale instead, meaning both axes are logarithmic. On a log-log graph, a country that perfectly follows the rank size rule will produce a straight diagonal line with a slope of -1. That's your visual anchor. Rank size compliance equals a straight line on the log-log graph. If the line curves or bows, something is deviating from the rule. Primate cities, when one city dominates everything. Now here's where things get interesting, and where most countries actually live. A primate city is the largest city in a country that is disproportionately larger than all other cities in that urban system. The rule of thumb, sometimes called the two-city index, is that a primate city is at least twice the size of the second largest city, but the concept goes beyond raw population numbers. A primate city dominates not just in size, but in economic power, political influence, cultural production, and media presence. It is, in a very real sense, the country's everything. Think about Bangkok, Thailand. Bangkok is home to roughly 10 million people in its metro area, while the second largest Thai city, Chiang Mai, is closer to 1 million. That's a staggering imbalance. Bangkok is not just bigger, it is where Thai finance, government, fashion, universities, and hospitals are concentrated. The same pattern holds for Paris in France, Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Lima in Peru. In each case, one city so thoroughly dominates the national urban hierarchy that the rank size rule's neat mathematical prediction breaks down completely. Why does primacy happen? On the AP exam, you need to connect primacy to development patterns. Primate cities are especially common in less economically developed countries, LEDCs, or in countries with a colonial history where infrastructure, investment, and political power were deliberately funneled into a single city, often a coastal port city designed to extract resources for a colonial power. Over time, that concentration becomes self-reinforcing. Industries cluster where workers are, workers go where industries are, and the cycle continues. Rank size versus primate, the core distinction. Here's the trap the exam loves to set. Students often assume that primate cities and the rank size rule are just two descriptions of the same thing. They're not. The rank size rule describes a balanced, predictable urban hierarchy typically associated with more economically developed countries, MEDCs, with long histories of urbanization and diversified regional economies, like the United States or Germany. Primate city distributions, by contrast, signal urban primacy, an imbalanced hierarchy. The AP exam frequently presents a city size table and asks whether the pattern reflects rank size regularity or urban primacy. Know how to tell them apart quantitatively. Also watch out for the binary city edge case. Some countries have two roughly equal dominant cities. Think of Ecuador as Quito, political capital, and Guayaquil, economic hub, or historically Washington, D.C. and New York. This is neither rank size nor primate. And if the AP gives you this scenario, the correct description is that the country has a dual primate city pattern, or simply does not conform to either model cleanly. The urban hierarchy and central place theory. You cannot fully understand this section without connecting it to central place theory from earlier in Unit 6. Walter Kristallers' model predicts that cities of different sizes serve different market areas and offer different threshold and range combinations for goods and services. The rank size rule, when it holds, essentially validates Kristallers' vision. A country with a balanced urban hierarchy has cities at every level: metropolises, regional centers, small towns, and villages, each serving the populations around them in a nested, logical system. When primacy occurs, that hierarchy collapses toward the top, meaning smaller cities and rural areas are underserved. This helps explain persistent regional inequality in many countries, which connects directly to Unit 7 themes of economic development and the urban-rural divide. FRQ, scoring points, and MCQ traps to remember. For free response questions, the College Board rewards precision. If you're asked to explain urban primacy, don't just say one city is biggest. Describe the disproportionate dominance and connect it to historical or economic causes. If asked about the rank size rule, use the formula and reference the log-log graph. The most common MCQ trap is conflating a large city with a primate city. Remember, primacy is about relative size and dominance within a system, not absolute population. A city of 2 million in a small country might be primate. A city of 8 million in a large, balanced country might not be. With your understanding of urban hierarchies now firmly in place, let's turn to the forces that have physically shaped the internal structure of cities, starting with the classic land use models that explain why your downtown looks nothing like your suburbs. 6.11 Suburbanization, Urban Sprawl and Counter-Urbanization. The Great Urban Escape and what it costs. Picture a city like a campfire. At first, everyone huddles close to the warmth, the jobs, the markets, the culture. But as the fire grows bigger and hotter, people naturally start backing up, spreading out, finding space. That, in essence, is the story of suburbanization, and understanding why it happens and what it looks like on a map is exactly what College Board wants you to master here. Let's build this carefully, because the AP exam loves to test the differences between three closely related but distinct processes: suburbanization, urban sprawl, and counter-urbanization. Students collapse these into one idea all the time, and that is a trap worth avoiding from the start. Suburbanization, the push and pull. Suburbanization is the process by which population and economic activity move away from the urban core, toward the periphery of a city, creating suburbs, residential and commercial areas on the edges of a metropolitan area. This is not random. It's driven by a predictable set of push and pull factors that you should be able to name and explain on an FRQ. The push factors out of the city historically included rising land costs, overcrowding, crime, pollution, and poor school quality in urban neighborhoods. The pull factors drawing people toward the suburbs were equally powerful: cheaper land, larger homes, perceived safety, better funded schools, and, critically, the automobile. You cannot tell the story of American suburbanization without the car and the interstate highway system. When President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, he essentially handed suburbanization a blank check. Suddenly, a family could live 30 miles from downtown and still make it to work. The suburbs exploded. This connects directly to Unit 5's discussion of infrastructure and development, and also to your earlier work on the bid rent theory from Unit 6. Remember, in the bid rent model, land value decreases as you move away from the central business district. Suburbanization is the human response to that gradient. Families bid less for land on the periphery, get more space for their money, and happily commute in. On your AP exam, if you're asked to draw or interpret a bid rent graph, remember it shows multiple declining curves, one for retail, steepest decline, one for industry, and one for residential, most gradual. Suburbanization occurs precisely in that outer residential zone where land is affordable enough to attract low-density housing. Urban sprawl, when suburbanization gets out of hand. Here's where many students conflate two things. Suburbanization is a process. Urban sprawl is a pattern, specifically a low-density, automobile-dependent, often unplanned expansion of urban land use into rural areas. Think of it as suburbanization's messy, uncontrolled cousin. Urban sprawl has several defining characteristics the exam tests directly. It involves leapfrog development, where developers skip over parcels of land and build further out, leaving undeveloped gaps. It requires heavy car dependency because distances are too great for walking or transit. It produces strip malls, cul-de-sacs, and single-use zoning, meaning residential areas are completely separated from commercial areas, so you literally cannot walk to the grocery store. This is the built environment of so much of post-America, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Houston, Atlanta. The consequences of urban sprawl matter for the exam because FRQs frequently ask you to evaluate its impacts. Environmental impacts include habitat destruction, increased impervious surfaces that cause runoff and flooding, and higher per capita carbon emissions since everyone is driving everywhere. Social impacts include what geographers call spatial mismatch, a critical term, where low-income workers, often concentrated in the urban core, cannot afford to live near the suburban job centers where entry-level work has relocated. That geographic disconnect between housing and employment is spatial mismatch, and it appears regularly in AP exam questions. The edge-of-city commercial zones that form at highway interchanges during sprawl are called edge cities, a concept introduced by journalist Joel Garreau. Edge cities have more jobs than bedrooms, contain significant office and retail space, and were mostly nothing but farmland 30 years ago. Tyson's Corner in Virginia and Schaumburg, Illinois are classic examples. Be ready to define edge cities and distinguish them from suburbs, which are primarily residential. Counter-urbanization, reversing the flow. Now, here's a concept students frequently misidentify on multiple-choice questions, so pay close attention. Counter-urbanization is not the same as suburbanization. Counter-urbanization is a process where people move out of urban areas entirely, not just to the suburbs, but to small towns and rural areas that are beyond the metropolitan fringe. The destination communities are not suburbs, they're genuinely rural or small-town places that people are choosing over urban life altogether. This trend accelerated noticeably during and after the COVID-19 pandemic, when remote work untethered millions of people from city centers. Someone who leaves Chicago to live in a small Wisconsin lake town, working remotely, is an example of counter-urbanization. The AP exam has begun incorporating these contemporary examples, so connecting the concept to remote work is both accurate and impressive in an FRQ response. Counter-urbanization has complex effects on receiving communities. It can raise local property values benefiting longtime homeowners, while displacing lower-income residents who can no longer afford housing, a rural form of gentrification. It can bring new economic activity and tax revenue, but also cultural tension when urban newcomers have different expectations about land use, noise, and services. Distinguishing the three, and acing the MCQ trap. Here is the distinction College Board loves to test. Suburbanization stays within the metropolitan area. Counter-urbanization moves beyond it entirely. A family moving from Manhattan to suburban New Jersey is suburbanization. A family moving from Manhattan to rural Vermont is counter-urbanization. If an MCQ gives you a scenario and asks which process it illustrates, look for whether the destination is metropolitan or genuinely rural and non-metropolitan. Another common trap involves re-urbanization, which is the reverse process, people moving back into city centers, often driven by gentrification and urban renewal. Students sometimes confuse re-urbanization with counter-urbanization because both involve changing migration patterns, but they move in opposite directions. Re-urbanization flows inward. Counter-urbanization flows outward beyond the metro area entirely. Connecting to the bigger picture. These concepts tie together beautifully across the course. The models you studied earlier in Unit 6, the concentric zone model, the sector model, the multiple nuclei model, all reflect stages of suburbanization in their outward expanding rings and nodes. The galactic city model is essentially a spatial representation of a fully sprawled metro area with multiple edge cities orbiting a historic core. When you write about urban land use, you're always in dialogue with these migration and expansion processes. Globally, it's worth noting that urban sprawl is not exclusively an American phenomenon. It's accelerating in rapidly developing cities across Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, often with even less infrastructure planning. The AP exam increasingly draws on global examples, so being able to apply these concepts to cities like Lagos, Mumbai, or São Paulo shows the kind of sophisticated geographic thinking that earns top scores. With suburbanization and its consequences firmly in your toolkit, you're ready to zoom in on the specific planning and policy responses that cities have developed to manage these challenges, which is exactly what comes next as we explore smart growth and new urbanism. 6.12 Urbanization in the Developing World, Megacities and Informal Settlements. Let's talk about one of the most dramatic transformations happening on Earth right now, a transformation so vast and fast that it genuinely has no precedent in human history. We're talking about urbanization in the developing world, and the megacities and informal settlements that are its most visible signature. If you've ever seen aerial footage of Lagos or São Paulo, these sprawling, almost incomprehensible masses of humanity, that's exactly what this section is about, and the AP exam loves this topic, so let's get into it properly. What is a megacity? Start with the basic definition and lock it in. A megacity is an urban agglomeration with a population of at least 10 million people. That's the College Board's threshold, and you must use it precisely, not 8 million, not 9 million, 10 million. As of the mid-2020s, there are roughly 35 to 40 megacities worldwide, and the overwhelming majority of them are located in the global south, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Tokyo has historically held the title of the world's largest urban agglomeration, but the real story on the exam isn't which city is biggest, it's where growth is happening and why. Here's the critical geographic pattern you need to internalize. In the early 20th century, megacities were predominantly in the developed world, New York, London, Paris, but today the list is dominated by cities like Dhaka, Kinshasa, Mumbai, Cairo, and Lagos. This geographic shift reflects a broader process called urban transition, where countries move from rural majority to urban majority populations. In the developing world, this transition is happening at a speed roughly 3 to 4 times faster than it did in Europe during the Industrial Revolution. Imagine a city the size of Phoenix appearing on the map every few weeks. That's essentially the pace of urban growth in sub-Saharan Africa right now. Push and pull factors, driving urbanization. You already know push and pull factors from Migration, Unit 2. Yes, this connects directly. Apply that same framework here. Rural poverty, agricultural mechanization, land scarcity, drought, and conflict push people off the land. Meanwhile, cities pull migrants with perceived economic opportunity, access to healthcare, education, and social networks of family members who migrated earlier. The key word there is perceived, and this matters enormously for the exam. Many migrants arrive expecting jobs that don't exist in sufficient numbers. The result is a labor surplus in the informal economy. This is where you introduce the concept of over-urbanization, a situation where a city grows faster than its infrastructure and economic base can support. Don't confuse over-urbanization with simply having a large population. A city can be huge and well-managed. Over-urbanization is specifically about the mismatch between population growth and the capacity to provide jobs, housing, sanitation, and services. It's like inviting 500 guests to a party where you've only set 20 places at the table. The party still happens, it's just chaotic. Informal settlements, squatter communities. The most visible consequence of over-urbanization is the informal settlement, also called a squatter settlement, shantytown, or by regional names like favela, Brazil, barrio, Latin America broadly, bastille, India, or bidonville, Francophone Africa. The AP exam may use any of these terms, so recognize them all. An informal settlement is an area of housing built on land. The occupants do not legally own, typically without official permits, running water, sewage systems, or reliable electricity, at least initially. Picture it this way. Someone migrates to Nairobi from a rural village. They have no money for rent in the formal housing market. So they find a patch of land on the city's edge, maybe a hillside that's too steep for formal development, or land next to railroad tracks, and they build a shelter out of whatever materials are available. Corrugated tin, plastic sheeting, salvaged wood. Over time, more people arrive and do the same. Streets emerge organically. Small businesses open. A community forms. What starts as a desperate survival strategy becomes a functioning, if severely underserved, neighborhood. This is the life cycle of an informal settlement, and understanding it matters for the exam. The key geographic model here is the Latin American city model, Griffin-Ford model, which you should be able to sketch and label. From the center outward, you have the CBD, a commercial spine, an elite residential sector extending outward along that spine, then concentric zones of housing quality that decrease as you move away, with the outermost ring being the zone of peripheral squatter settlements. This is the exact opposite of the classic Burgess concentric zone model of North American cities, where the poorest housing clusters nearest the center. On the exam, that contrast is a favorite MCQ trap. Students who memorize one model and apply it universally will get this wrong. The developing world does not follow the same spatial logic as Chicago in 1925. The African city model, Sturt D. Blage model, is also fair game. It features multiple CBDs reflecting colonial and informal market zones, with ethnic neighborhoods and an informal sector that's spatially distinct. You don't need to draw it in as much detail as Griffin-Ford, but recognize that no single model fits all cities, and the exam may ask you to identify which model applies to a given scenario. Common MCQ traps and FRQ points. Watch out for a few classic traps. First, don't equate developing world city with declining city. Many megacities in the global south are economically dynamic. They're growing because they're attracting opportunity. Second, don't assume informal settlements are purely negative. Research by geographers like Robert Neuwirth emphasizes that they represent extraordinary human ingenuity and community formation, and many eventually get upgraded with formal services through a process called site and service schemes, or squatter upgrading, where governments provide basic infrastructure and grant residents legal title to their land. If an FRQ asks for a policy response to informal settlements, squatter upgrading is a high-value answer that demonstrates real geographic knowledge. For FRQs, the scoring rubric almost always rewards specific place examples. Don't just say a city in South America. Say Rocinha in Rio de Janeiro, Dharavi in Mumbai, or Kibera in Nairobi. These are among the world's largest informal settlements, and they're cited repeatedly in AP curriculum materials. Connections across units. This topic threads through the entire course. It connects to Unit 2's migration and push-pull factors, Unit 5's agricultural land use and rural to urban migration, and Unit 7's development indicators, because informal settlement prevalence is itself a measure of development disparity. When you see a question about a country with a high urban primacy, one dominant megacity dwarfing all others, think Bangkok in Thailand or Lima in Peru. Think about over-urbanization and informal settlements as likely consequences. The story of the developing world's megacities is ultimately a story about human adaptation, millions of people rewriting the rules of urban life in real time. Next, we'll zoom in on the internal structure of these cities, examining the models geographers use to understand and predict how urban land use is organized around the world. 6.13 Slums, Squatter Settlements, and Self-Help Housing. The reality behind the statistics. Let's start with a mental image. Picture a city like Sao Paulo, Brazil, skyscrapers and gleaming office towers casting shadows over densely packed hillside communities made of brick, corrugated metal, and repurposed wood. Or imagine the outskirts of Mumbai, where the Dharavi settlement houses over 1 million people in just over 2 square kilometers. These aren't exceptions to urban growth. They are urban growth across much of the developing world. And for your AP exam, understanding why they exist, how they function, and what they tell us about global urbanization is absolutely essential. When geographers talk about informal settlements, a term College Board uses broadly, they mean residential areas that develop outside formal legal frameworks. The housing is built without official permits, the land is occupied without legal title, and the infrastructure is improvised rather than planned. You'll see these called squatter settlements, shanty towns, and in many countries by their local names, favelas in Brazil, busties in India, gecekondu in Turkey, which literally translates to built overnight, and that tells you everything about how quickly these communities emerge, and bidonvilles in French-speaking Africa. The AP exam uses informal settlements and squatter settlements interchangeably, so know both. Why they form the push-pull mechanism. To understand informal settlements, you have to connect back to Unit 2, Migration Theory. Rural to urban migration driven by push factors, agricultural mechanization, drought, rural poverty, and pull factors, perceived economic opportunity, access to services, family networks, fuels explosive urban growth in cities across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. The critical insight here is that locally cities in the global south are growing faster than their formal housing markets can accommodate. When a city like Lagos or Dhaka absorbs hundreds of thousands of rural migrants every year, those migrants need somewhere to sleep, tonight. Formal housing, which requires permits, capital, credit, and time, simply can't keep pace. Informal settlements are the rational response to an irrational gap between housing supply and demand. This connects directly to the urban primacy concept from earlier in Unit 6. Primate cities, those that dominate their national urban systems, attract disproportionate migration flows, which intensifies the pressure on informal housing markets. When you see an MCQ asking why informal settlements cluster near primate cities in the developing world, the answer is always about the intersection of intense migration pressure and inadequate formal housing capacity. Characteristics. You must know cold. For the exam, you need to recognize the defining features of informal settlements. They typically lack reliable access to clean water, sanitation, electricity, and paved roads. Population densities are extreme. Dharavi, for instance, has a density exceeding 300,000 people per square kilometer. Structures are built incrementally from whatever materials residents can afford. Land tenure is insecure, meaning residents can be evicted without legal recourse. And yet, and this is a point the AP exam loves to test, these are not simply zones of hopeless poverty. They are economically active, socially organized communities. The informal economy thrives here. Small enterprises, repair shops, textile producers, food vendors, Dharavi alone generates an estimated $1 billion in annual economic output. Self-help housing, the Turner model. Here's where the concept gets genuinely fascinating and where many students stumble on the exam. Self-help housing refers to the process by which residents themselves construct and incrementally improve their dwellings over time, often with community cooperation. The geographer John F.C. Turner, working in Peru in the 1960s and 70s, revolutionized how planners thought about squatter settlements by arguing that they shouldn't be demolished, they should be supported. Turner observed that given security of land tenure, the legal right to stay, residents would naturally invest in improving their homes. A tin roof becomes concrete block walls. A dirt floor becomes tile. Over time, the settlement consolidates into permanent, livable housing, not through top-down government planning, but through bottom-up resident investment. This process is called settlement consolidation, or consolidation of informal settlements, and the AP exam expects you to understand it as a developmental trajectory rather than a static condition. Think of it like a seedling. Given the right conditions, tenure security, access to credit, basic infrastructure investment, an informal settlement can mature into a stable working-class neighborhood over decades. Rocinha in Rio de Janeiro and Mathare in Nairobi both illustrate this trajectory. Sites and services programs. Governments and NGOs responded to Turner's insights with sites and services programs, a concept you absolutely must know for both MCQs and FRQs. Instead of building housing for migrants, the government provides a surveyed plot of land with basic infrastructure connections, water standpipes, sanitation hookups, access roads, and then lets residents build their own homes using self-help methods. It's far cheaper than constructing formal housing. It leverages the labor and ingenuity of residents, and it produces communities people are genuinely invested in maintaining. The World Bank funded sites and services programs widely in the 1970s and 80s. For the exam, when you see a question about government responses to informal settlements in the developing world, sites and services is a key answer alongside tenure regularization, granting legal land titles to existing squatters. Common MCQ traps and FRQ points. The most dangerous trap on this topic is assuming informal settlements are exclusively negative or that government should simply demolish them. Demolition, sometimes called slum clearance, is repeatedly shown to disperse poverty without eliminating it, often destroying the social networks and economic activities that made the settlement viable. If an MCQ presents demolition as the best policy response, be very skeptical. Another classic trap is confusing informal settlements with homelessness. These are communities of housed people, just in unplanned structures on unregistered land. For FRQs, College Board rewards students who can explain the geographic factors that determine settlement location. Informal settlements cluster on marginal land, steep hillsides, floodplains, land near polluting industries, railroad margins, because that is land nobody else wanted, which means lower risk of eviction. When you're asked to explain the spatial pattern of informal settlements within a city, marginal land is your anchor concept. Also connect this topic to Wallerstein's world systems theory from Unit 1. The concentration of informal settlements in the global south reflects the structural economic position of periphery and semi-periphery nations within the global economy, where capital accumulation is insufficient to fund formal housing provision at scale. The bigger picture. Informal settlements aren't a problem to be solved so much as evidence of a structural mismatch between the pace of urbanization and the capacity of formal institutions to respond. Understanding them means understanding migration, economic development, land tenure, and urban planning all at once, which is exactly why College Board places this topic at the culmination of Unit 6. As we move forward, we'll build on these ideas to examine how urban planners and geographers are rethinking sustainable urban development, including smart growth, new urbanism, and the broader question of what a livable city actually looks like in the 21st century. 6.14 Urban Renewal, Gentrification, and Displacement. Setting the stage, what is urban renewal? Let's start by painting a picture. Imagine a neighborhood in a major American city, Detroit, Baltimore, or Philadelphia, for instance, circa 1960. Factory jobs have evaporated, middle-class families have followed the highways out to the suburbs, and the tax base has collapsed. Storefronts are boarded up, housing stock is deteriorating, and city officials are staring at a map wondering what to do. That moment of crisis is precisely where the concept of urban renewal is born. Urban renewal refers to programs and policies, often government-led, designed to rehabilitate or redevelop declining urban areas. On the AP exam, College Board expects you to understand urban renewal not just as a feel-good idea, but as a contested process with winners and losers. The federal government supercharged urban renewal in the United States through the Housing Acts of 1949 and 1954, which gave cities funding to clear blighted neighborhoods and rebuild them. The trouble, as you'll want to remember, is that blight was often defined in ways that targeted low-income and minority communities. Highways were cut through historically black neighborhoods. Public housing towers replaced tight-knit communities. Critics eventually nicknamed these programs urban removal rather than renewal, and that tension is absolutely something the AP exam loves to probe. Gentrification, the market-driven version. Now fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s. Instead of bulldozers and government contracts, something subtler starts happening. Young professionals attracted by low rents, walkable streets, and proximity to downtown jobs start moving into those same deteriorating neighborhoods. They renovate brownstones, open coffee shops, and install bike lanes. Property values begin climbing. This process is gentrification, and it's one of the most heavily tested concepts in Unit 6. Geographer Ruth Glass coined the term in London in 1964, and the definition has held. Gentrification is the process by which higher-income residents and investment move into a lower-income urban neighborhood, gradually transforming its character, raising property values and rents, and often displacing the original residents. Think of Brooklyn's Williamsburg, Austin's East Side, or Chicago's Pilsen, neighborhoods that went from affordable to aspirational within a generation. For the AP exam, you need to understand gentrification through two lenses: the demand side and the supply side. On the demand side, gentrification is driven by young, educated workers choosing urban living, often enabled by the back-to-the-city movement that reversed suburbanization trends. On the supply side, cheap existing housing stock in older urban neighborhoods offers comparatively low entry costs for renovation and investment. These two forces meeting in the same place at the same time is the engine of gentrification. Displacement, the human cost. Here is where the story gets morally complicated, and where College Board wants you to think critically rather than just recite definitions. Displacement is the process by which existing residents, typically lower income, often communities of color, are forced out of gentrifying neighborhoods because rising rents, property taxes, or changed neighborhood character make staying impossible. Displacement is not always dramatic. It can be direct. A landlord refuses to renew a lease or converts rentals to condominiums. Or it can be indirect displacement, sometimes called exclusionary displacement, where a neighborhood's costs rise so much that new lower-income residents simply can't move in even if long-term residents manage to hang on. The AP exam may present you with a scenario and ask you to identify which type of displacement is occurring. Don't confuse the two. A critical connection here runs back to redlining, which you covered earlier in Unit 6. Historically redlined neighborhoods, areas where federal agencies and banks systematically denied mortgages to minority residents, are disproportionately the ones experiencing gentrification today because decades of disinvestment left their housing stock cheap and their land undervalued. When you see a free response question about gentrification, weaving in the historical legacy of redlining as a cause of the conditions that made gentrification possible is the kind of layered analysis that earns full scoring credit. Visualizing the process, the neighborhood change model. While there is no single universally standardized diagram for gentrification the way there is for, say, the Von Thunen model, you should be able to sketch and interpret a neighborhood change timeline if an FRQ asks you to diagram the process. Picture a simple graph with time on the x-axis and property values or median income on the y-axis. The curve starts high, original working class or mixed neighborhood, dips sharply during the period of disinvestment and population loss, then curves sharply upward during the gentrification phase as investment returns. That U-shaped or J-shaped curve tells the whole story visually. Label the trough as the period of blight or urban decline, and label the rising right side as the gentrification phase, and annotate that displacement accelerates as the curve steepens. Common MCQ traps and confusions. The AP exam loves to blur two pairs of concepts that students routinely mix up. First, do not confuse urban renewal with gentrification. Urban renewal is government-led and policy-driven. Gentrification is primarily market-driven, led by private investment and individual housing choices. The government can facilitate gentrification through zoning changes or tax incentives, but the mechanism is fundamentally different. Second, do not confuse displacement with suburbanization. Suburbanization is households voluntarily choosing the suburbs for space, schools, or lifestyle. Displacement is involuntary movement caused by rising costs or policy decisions. The key word is involuntary. Another trap. The exam sometimes presents gentrification as an unambiguous good or bad and asks you to evaluate it. Resist that temptation. College Board rewards nuance. Gentrification does bring infrastructure investment, reduced vacancy rates, and lower crime in some cases. But it also erodes affordable housing, cultural identity, and social networks for displaced communities. When an FRQ asks you to explain how gentrification affects urban communities, always present at least one benefit and one cost, and tie both to specific geographic or demographic consequences. Connections across units. This topic connects outward in several important directions. From Unit 2 population, you can apply push and pull factors to explain why both gentrifiers move in and displaced residents move out. From Unit 4 political patterns, think about how municipal zoning policy and urban planning decisions either accelerate or slow gentrification. From Unit 7, industrial and economic development, the shift from manufacturing to service and knowledge economies explains why educated young workers cluster in cities and create gentrification pressure in the first place. When you trace those threads across units in an FRQ, you're demonstrating exactly the kind of geographic reasoning that scores a 5. As we close this section, keep in mind that urban renewal and gentrification are really two chapters of the same story, one written by government, one written by the market, both reshaping who belongs in the city and who gets pushed to its edges. With that geographic lens on power, investment, and community, you're ready to move into our next topic: how cities plan for sustainable growth and manage the very pressures gentrification creates through smart growth policies and new urbanism. 6.15 Transportation and Urban Form. The city and its circulatory system. Let's start with a question that seems almost too simple. Why do cities look the way they do? Why is Los Angeles a sprawling, car-dependent maze, while Manhattan is a dense vertical jungle? Why does Paris radiate outward from a central core like spokes on a wheel, while Phoenix feels like a giant grid stretched flat under the desert sun? The answer in each case has a lot to do with transportation, and understanding that relationship is exactly what College Board wants you to demonstrate on exam day. Think of transportation infrastructure as a city's circulatory system. Just as the layout of blood vessels shapes how oxygen reaches every corner of your body, the layout of roads, rail lines, and transit corridors shapes how people, goods, and capital reach every corner of an urban area. Change the circulatory system, and you change the entire organism. That is the core idea behind this section, and it runs through virtually every model and concept you've studied in Unit 6. How transportation shapes urban structure. Here is the foundational principle you need to internalize. Transportation technology determines the spatial extent and internal organization of cities. This is not just a historical curiosity, it is a living dynamic that you can observe today. Geographers identify several distinct eras of urban form, each tied to a dominant transportation mode. In the pre-industrial or walking city era, cities were compact and dense because everyone traveled on foot. Think of medieval European city centers. Everything had to be within about a mile or two of the center, because that's how far a person could reasonably walk. This produces a characteristic form, very high density in the core, dropping off sharply at the edges, with almost no sprawl. Then came the streetcar or transit city era in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Suddenly, people could live 2, 3, or 4 miles from the urban core and still commute to work. Cities began to elongate along transit corridors, producing the classic star-shaped or octopus urban form you may have seen in diagrams. The arms of the star extend outward along transit lines. The spaces between them remain relatively undeveloped. If you are asked on the exam to describe why early 20th century cities had a star-shaped footprint, your answer centers on streetcar and rail infrastructure. The automobile era, beginning in earnest after World War II and accelerating with the interstate highway system in the United States, is where things really explode. The car fills in those gaps between the streetcar arms, allows development on every parcel of land at the urban fringe, and produces the low-density, sprawling metropolitan form associated with Sunbelt cities like Phoenix, Houston, and Atlanta. This is the automobile city, and it is the dominant form of urban development in the late 20th and early 21st centuries across the United States. Key models and diagrams. You must be able to interpret. When College Board asks you to engage with urban models on the exam, transportation is almost always lurking in the background. The concentric zone model, developed by Ernest Burgess in the 1920s, describes a city organized around a central business district with rings of different land uses expanding outward, and it implicitly assumes a transit-centered city where proximity to the center equals accessibility. The sector model, developed by Homer Hoyt, explicitly incorporates transportation corridors. High-income residential areas develop along the best transit and highway routes, fanning outward from the center in wedge-shaped sectors. If you see a question asking why wealthy neighborhoods tend to cluster along certain radial corridors, Hoyt's model is your anchor. For the exam, you should be able to sketch a basic Hoyt sector model showing sectors radiating outward from a CBD, with one sector labeled high-income residential along a major transit or highway corridor, industrial sectors along rail lines or waterways, and working-class residential sectors in between. This is a diagram that appears in both multiple-choice image interpretation and as a possible FRQ reference. Edge of city development, beltways and edge cities. Here's where the exam gets more nuanced and where students often lose points. The construction of circumferential highways, think I-285 around Atlanta, I-270 around Columbus, or the Beltway around Washington, D.C., fundamentally reorganized metropolitan geography. These roads allow movement not just in and out of the urban core, but around it. The result is the emergence of edge cities, a concept introduced by journalist Joel Garreau that College Board uses explicitly. An edge city is a concentration of business, retail, and entertainment that develops at the intersection of major highways, particularly beltways and radial highways outside the traditional downtown Tysons Corner in Virginia. The Galleria area in Houston and Schaumburg, Illinois are classic examples. Edge cities have more office space than a typical suburb but lack a traditional downtown history. You need to know this term and be able to distinguish edge cities from suburbs. Edge cities are employment centers, not just residential areas. The common MCQ traps you need to avoid. One of the most reliable wrong answer traps on this topic is confusing cause and effect. Transportation infrastructure does not merely follow urban development, it actively generates it. When the federal government built the interstate highway system, it did not just connect existing cities, it created new development nodes, stimulated suburban sprawl, and hollowed out many urban cores by making it easy for residents and businesses to leave. This is a directional relationship. Infrastructure investment shapes land use, not just the reverse. A second trap involves assuming that transit always promotes density equally in all directions. Rail lines and highways are linear. They concentrate development along corridors, not uniformly across the urban landscape. When you see a question about why development clusters along specific axes rather than spreading evenly, the answer is almost always tied to transportation corridor alignment. Connections to other units. Transportation and urban form connects deeply to earlier Unit 6 material. You cannot understand bid-rent theory without recognizing that accessibility to transportation nodes drives land values. It also connects to Unit 5's discussion of agricultural land use through the von Thunen model, which shares the same core logic. Distance from a central point, mediated by transportation costs, organizes spatial patterns. In Unit 7, when you study industrialization and economic development, transportation infrastructure, ports, rail networks, highway systems is a primary explanatory variable for why economic activity concentrates where it does. Tying it together. The central takeaway for the exam is this. Transportation technology sets the outer boundary of the city, determines its internal organization, and shapes the life chances of the people who live in it. Cities built for walking are dense and walkable today. Cities built for the car are difficult to retrofit for transit. And cities that invest in new rail infrastructure watch new density nodes emerge almost immediately around station areas, a phenomenon called transit-oriented development, or TOD, that you should absolutely know by name. With transportation's role in shaping urban form now firmly in your mental model, you are perfectly set up to explore how planners and policymakers try to actively redesign cities for sustainability, equity, and resilience, which is exactly where we are headed next. 6 Tone 6, Sustainable Cities, Smart Growth, and new urbanism. The big idea: cities can be designed better. Imagine two versions of the same city. In the first version, you need a car for absolutely everything. You drive 5 minutes to pick up milk, you drive 20 minutes to work, and the nearest park is a 15-minute drive across a highway overpass. In the second version, you walk to the corner bakery, bike to work along a tree-lined path, and your kids play in the plaza outside your apartment. Same city, same land area, radically different quality of life. That contrast is exactly what sustainable cities, smart growth, and new urbanism are all about. And it's a topic College Board loves to test because it sits right at the intersection of planning, environment, culture, and social equity, which are all themes woven throughout Unit 6. Defining the core concepts. Let's start with the vocabulary because the AP exam will absolutely test whether you can distinguish these three related but distinct ideas. Sustainable cities are urban areas designed to minimize environmental impact, reduce resource consumption, and meet the needs of current residents without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. That's the classic Brundtland Commission definition of sustainability you should already know from earlier in this course. In urban terms, this means reducing carbon emissions, managing waste responsibly, protecting green space, and building resilient infrastructure. Think of cities like Copenhagen, Denmark, which has invested heavily in cycling infrastructure and aims to be carbon neutral, or Curitiba, Brazil, which built a world-renowned bus rapid transit system that became a global model for sustainable transport in the developing world. Curitiba is an example College Board has referenced before, so keep it in your mental library. Smart growth is a planning philosophy and policy framework, really a set of principles that guides how cities should expand and develop. The core idea is that cities should grow upward and inward rather than outward. Smart growth actively fights against sprawl, which you studied in the context of the Galactic City Model and Edge Cities back in sections 6.7 through 6.10. Smart growth principles include mixing land uses so that residential, commercial, and recreational spaces are all close together, encouraging compact, walkable neighborhoods, prioritizing infill development, that means building on vacant or underused land within existing city boundaries rather than chewing up farmland at the fringe, and protecting environmentally sensitive areas. An urban growth boundary, or UGB, is one of the most powerful smart growth tools you need to know. Portland, Oregon's urban growth boundary is the textbook example. The city drew a literal line around the metro area and said development must stay inside it, which has helped preserve surrounding farmland and forests while pushing investment back into the city core. New urbanism is an urban design movement. Think of it as the architectural and neighborhood scale expression of smart growth ideals. It was formally organized in the 1990s and is guided by the Congress for the New Urbanism, which published a charter laying out its principles. New urbanism advocates for creating neighborhoods that are walkable, mixed-use, and human-scaled. The classic new urbanist development looks like a traditional small American town, a grid street pattern, houses close to the sidewalk with front porches, shops, and schools within walking distance, and a central public space like a town square. Seaside, Florida is the original flagship example and appears frequently in AP materials. Celebration, Florida, developed by Disney near Orlando, is another. These are called traditional neighborhood developments, or TNDs, and you should know that term for the exam. How these concepts connect to land use models. Here's where it gets really useful for your exam. Smart growth and new urbanism are direct responses to the urban patterns you've already studied. Low-density sprawl is what happens when cities follow the logic of the Galactic City or Edge City model, with no planning constraints. You get car-dependent suburbs, traffic congestion, environmental degradation, and what planners call the heat island effect, where cities become significantly warmer than surrounding rural areas because of all the concrete and asphalt absorbing heat. Smart growth and new urbanism push back against those outcomes. When you see an FRQ asking you to evaluate trade-offs in urban planning, connecting these concepts to sprawl, the zone of transition or bid rent theory, the idea that land use intensity and price decrease with distance from the CBD, shows the grader you understand the full Unit 6 picture. The equity dimension you cannot ignore. A concept the AP exam has increasingly emphasized is that sustainable urban planning is not just an environmental question, it's a social justice question. Green gentrification is a term you should know. When a neighborhood gets upgraded with parks, bike lanes, and sustainable infrastructure, property values often rise, displacing the lower-income residents the improvements were supposed to benefit. This connects directly to redlining, block busting, and the historical geography of who gets access to quality urban spaces, concepts you encountered earlier in this unit. When an FRQ asks you to discuss the challenges or limitations of smart growth or new urbanism, bring in equity. A common MCQ trap is to present new urbanism as a universally positive solution. The correct answer often acknowledges that these developments can be expensive and exclusive, attracting wealthier residents rather than creating diverse, affordable communities. MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. The most common wrong answer trap on MCQs for this section is confusing smart growth with new urbanism. Remember, smart growth is the broader policy framework about where and how a city grows. New urbanism is the design movement about what individual neighborhoods look like. They are complementary but not identical. Another trap is assuming all sustainable city initiatives are top-down government programs. Many are bottom-up, driven by community organizations, nonprofits, or private developers adopting LEED certification standards for green building. LEED, which stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, is a rating system you may see referenced in stimuli. For FRQs, College Board loves to ask you to explain how a specific urban planning strategy addresses a specific urban problem. Your answer needs a strategy, a mechanism explaining how it works, and a real-world example. If a question asks about reducing urban sprawl, your answer might mention urban growth boundaries, explain that they restrict outward expansion and redirect development inward, and cite Portland as your example. That three-part structure, strategy, mechanism, example is a reliable way to hit rubric points. Connecting it all together. Think of this section as the hopeful conclusion to everything challenging Unit 6 has laid out. You've seen how industrialization created chaotic cities, how suburban sprawl hollowed out urban cores, and how segregation shaped who lives where. Sustainable cities, smart growth, and new urbanism represent the planning world's best current answers to those accumulated problems. Imperfect answers, but answers rooted in evidence, design, and a genuine belief that cities can be better for both people and the planet. With that hopeful note in hand, you're ready to step back and look at the big picture, because the next section pulls everything in Unit 6 together and asks you to think about how all of these urban processes and patterns connect to the broader forces of globalization, economic development, and cultural change shaping cities worldwide. 6-7 Urban blight, redlining, and blockbusting. Setting the stage. What happened to American cities? Imagine you're looking at a photograph of Detroit in 1950. Bustling downtown, packed streetcars, thriving neighborhoods, factories humming. Now imagine that same city in 1980, abandoned buildings, crumbling infrastructure, whole blocks emptied out like a ghost town. What happened? The answer isn't one thing. It's a web of interconnected policies and practices, and for the AP exam, you need to understand each thread of that web with precision. Urban blight, redlining, and blockbusting are the three concepts at the center of this story, and they're almost always tested together because they caused and reinforced each other in a devastating cycle. Urban blight, the condition. Let's start with urban blight, which is the physical and economic deterioration of an urban area. Think of blight as the symptom you see: vacant lots, boarded storefronts, deteriorating housing stock, declining property values, rising unemployment. On the AP exam, College Board describes urban blight as the process by which a neighborhood or district falls into disrepair due to a combination of disinvestment, population loss, and economic decline. The key word here is disinvestment. When capital, people, and services leave a place, that place decays. Blight doesn't happen randomly. It's the downstream result of specific decisions, many of them deliberate policies. The causes of blight connect directly back to topics you studied earlier in Unit 6: suburbanization and white flight. The large-scale migration of white middle-class residents to suburbs following World War II drained cities of their tax base. When residents leave, they take their tax dollars with them, which means fewer resources for schools, infrastructure, and services, which drives more residents to leave. That's a feedback loop, and the AP exam loves testing whether you recognize it as one. Blight accelerates when you layer in deindustrialization as factories closed or relocated in the Rust Belt during the 1970s and 1980s. Cities like Cleveland, Baltimore, and Pittsburgh lost both jobs and residents simultaneously. This connects directly to your Unit 6 content on economic landscapes and to concepts from Unit 7 on industrial location theory. When manufacturing moves, urban form follows. Redlining, the policy that starved neighborhoods. Now here's where the history gets deeply intentional and where the AP exam gets very specific about terminology. Redlining was the practice by which banks, insurance companies, and the federal government, specifically the Home Owners Loan Corporation, or AOLC, in the 1930s, drew maps of American cities and literally outlined certain neighborhoods in red to designate them as too risky for mortgage lending. Those red zones were almost universally black neighborhoods, immigrant communities, and lower-income areas. Here's the analogy that makes this click. Imagine you're trying to buy a house and the bank tells you that the neighborhood you want to live in is literally unmortgageable. You can't get a loan. You can't build equity. You can't participate in the wealth-building engine that post-war America handed to millions of white families through the GI Bill and FHA loans. That's exactly what happened to Black Americans across the country. Redlining wasn't just discriminatory, it was a mechanism that concentrated poverty and prevented generational wealth accumulation. For the AP exam, make sure you can connect redlining to its effects. It funneled investment away from certain neighborhoods, accelerated physical deterioration, and created the conditions for blight. A critical exam distinction: redlining is a form of institutional or structural discrimination, not necessarily individual prejudice. The FRQ scoring rubrics reward students who articulate that redlining was a federal and institutional policy, not just private bank behavior. When you see a question about the causes of racial wealth gaps or residential segregation in American cities, redlining is almost always a central answer. Blockbusting, the predatory practice. If redlining starved neighborhoods of investment, blockbusting was the predatory scheme that exploited the resulting fear and panic. Blockbusting was a real estate practice, most common in the 1950s through 1970s, in which real estate agents would deliberately introduce one Black family into a previously all-white neighborhood, then use fear of declining property values to pressure white homeowners into selling quickly and cheaply. The agents would buy low from panicked white sellers, then sell or rent high to Black buyers who, remember, had almost nowhere else to go because redlining had locked them out of suburban mortgage markets. The analogy here is almost like a controlled demolition of a community. The agent drops one stone into still water, watches the ripples of panic spread, and profits from the chaos. The result was rapid, neighborhood racial transition, combined with real estate speculation that extracted enormous wealth from both white sellers and Black buyers. White residents left. Property values did decline, not because of who moved in, but because banks then refused to lend in those neighborhoods, making them harder to maintain. The self-fulfilling prophecy of the red line completed its own logic. For the FRQ, a common rubric point asks you to explain the relationship between blockbusting and residential segregation. The answer is direct. Blockbusting simultaneously accelerated white flight from urban neighborhoods and concentrated Black residents in areas that banks were already refusing to serve, deepening both segregation and disinvestment. Common traps and exam precision. The biggest MCQ trap on this topic is confusing the sequence or the causality. Redlining didn't cause blockbusting, and blockbusting didn't cause redlining. They operated in parallel, reinforcing each other within the broader context of suburbanization and racial discrimination. Another trap. Students sometimes credit blight purely to natural economic cycles or individual choices, missing the structural policy dimension. If an MCQ asks what primarily caused urban disinvestment in mid-20th century American cities, the correct answer will reference discriminatory lending practices and federal housing policy, not just population preference. Also know the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which legally prohibited redlining and housing discrimination, but the AP exam may ask you about why its effects were limited, which connects to continued de facto segregation and ongoing disinvestment even after de jure discrimination ended. Connections across the course. This topic ties directly to Unit 6's broader themes of urban models and residential patterns, particularly the concepts of invasion and succession from the concentric zone model, where neighborhoods transition from one group to another. It connects to Unit 3's themes of cultural patterns and ethnicity in the built environment, and to Unit 5's discussion of economic development and inequality. Whenever the exam asks about spatial inequality, residential segregation, or the geography of poverty in American cities, the framework you've built here, blight, redlining, blockbusting, is your analytical toolkit. With the damage these policies inflicted on urban neighborhoods clearly in view, we're ready to turn to the efforts made to reverse that damage, and the complicated legacy of urban renewal and gentrification that followed. 6.18 Infrastructure Challenges and Urban Services. The foundation beneath our feet. Let's start with a simple thought experiment. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and nothing works. No running water, no electricity, the roads outside are crumbling, and your internet is gone. Welcome, unintentionally, to the daily reality of millions of people living in rapidly urbanizing cities across the global south. That scenario captures the heart of what we're exploring in this section: the enormous gap between the pace of urban growth and a city's ability to provide the services and infrastructure its residents need to survive and thrive. Infrastructure, in AP Human Geography terms, refers to the basic physical systems that allow a city to function. Think roads, bridges, water treatment and distribution, sewage systems, electrical grids, public transit, and telecommunications network. Urban services extend this concept into the social realm: schools, hospitals, fire stations, police, and waste management. The College Board wants you to understand not just what these things are, but why so many cities struggle to provide them, and what the consequences look like on the ground. Why infrastructure lags behind growth. The core tension you need to understand is this: cities in the developing world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and parts of Latin America, are growing at speeds that their governments simply cannot match with infrastructure investment. This is directly tied to concepts you've already studied. Think back to Unit 2 and the demographic transition model. Countries in stages 2 and 3 have high rates of natural increase and are experiencing massive rural to urban migration driven by push-pull factors. The result is what geographers call over-urbanization, a condition where the urban population grows faster than the city's economy and infrastructure can support. Here's the analogy that makes this click. Imagine you're hosting a dinner party for 10 people, and you've set 10 places at the table, then 40 people show up. You're not a bad host, you simply weren't prepared for the scale. That's over-urbanization in a city like Lagos, Dhaka, or Kinshasa. The infrastructure was designed for a certain population load, and the influx of migrants and natural growth has overwhelmed it. The critical term the AP exam loves to test here is primate city from Unit 6.2. Because many developing countries have one dominant city that absorbs a disproportionate share of migration. That city faces crushing infrastructure pressure, while secondary cities remain underdeveloped. If you see a question asking why a single city has severe infrastructure deficits, while the rest of the country is relatively stable, primate city dynamics are almost always part of the answer. Informal settlements and service deficits. When infrastructure cannot keep pace with population growth, informal settlements emerge, and this is where you need to be especially precise with your terminology. The College Board uses squatter settlements and informal settlements, sometimes shanty towns, or regionally specific terms like favelas in Brazil, barrios in Venezuela, kampungs in Indonesia, or townships in South Africa. These are unplanned residential areas, often built on land the residents don't legally own, typically without access to clean water, sewage systems, or reliable electricity. A common MCQ trap here: students confuse the cause and the effect. The lack of infrastructure doesn't create informal settlements. Rapid, unplanned urban growth creates them, and the lack of infrastructure is the consequence. Make sure your directional thinking is correct on FRQs. The human consequences are staggering and measurable. Without clean water infrastructure, waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid spread rapidly. Without sewage systems, waste contaminates drinking sources, a problem called water insecurity. Without electricity, children can't study after dark. Refrigeration is impossible, and economic productivity is severely limited. The College Board may ask you to connect infrastructure deficits to quality of life indicators like the Human Development Index, HDI, from Unit 2. Lower HDI scores often correlate directly with poor urban infrastructure in rapidly growing cities. The fiscal and governance problem. Here's a layer of complexity that separates a 4 from a 5 on this exam. It's not enough to say cities in developing countries lack infrastructure. You need to understand why the gap persists. Municipal governments in rapidly growing cities face a brutal fiscal challenge. Their tax base often cannot keep up with demand for services. Many residents of informal settlements are part of the informal economy, meaning their economic activity isn't taxed, so the city collects little revenue from its fastest-growing population segments. Meanwhile, that same population requires the most investment in new infrastructure. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Corruption and governance failures compound this. International organizations like the World Bank and UN Habitat have documented extensively how infrastructure funds are diverted, contracts are awarded corruptly, and planning regulations are ignored or unenforced. For the AP exam, connecting infrastructure challenges to themes of political geography and governance quality shows the kind of synthesis the FRQ rubric rewards. Developed world infrastructure challenges. Don't get trapped. Here's the MCQ trap that catches so many students. Infrastructure challenges are not exclusively a developing world problem. The AP exam absolutely tests this. In wealthy cities, think Flint, Michigan, or aging transit systems in New York and London, the challenge is maintaining and upgrading aging infrastructure rather than building new infrastructure from scratch. The American Society of Civil Engineers has given U.S. infrastructure a C rating, noting crumbling bridges, lead water pipes, and outdated electrical grids. When you see a question about infrastructure challenges in a developed country context, pivot your thinking from lack of construction to deferred maintenance and capital decay. This also connects to the concept of urban blight and the declining industrial cities you studied in the context of deindustrialization and the Rust Belt. Cities that lost population and tax revenue after manufacturing declined couldn't fund infrastructure upkeep, a process the College Board sometimes frames through counter-urbanization dynamics. Connecting to the big picture, for FRQ responses, remember that infrastructure challenges connect upward and downward through the course. They link to Unit 5's food security discussion, agricultural infrastructure like irrigation, Unit 2's demographic transition, population growth pressures, Unit 7's development indicators, HDI, poverty traps, and Unit 6's discussions of urban models, land use, and sustainability. When an FRQ asks you to evaluate a city's ability to achieve sustainable development goals, infrastructure provision, particularly clean water, sanitation, and reliable energy, is always a central pillar of your answer. The one diagram worth mentally rehearsing here is a simple annotated urban cross-section or concentric zone diagram where you can overlay infrastructure access. Mark areas near the CBD with robust service provision and mark the urban fringe or informal peripheral zones with service deficits. That spatial thinking, where services exist versus where they don't, is exactly the kind of geographic reasoning the College Board rewards. As you move into the next section on urban sustainability and smart growth strategies, you'll see how cities and planners are actively trying to close these infrastructure gaps, and why some of those solutions create new problems of their own. 6.19 Zoning Laws and Land Use Regulations. What zoning actually is, and why cities can't live without it. Imagine you wake up one morning and your neighbor has opened a slaughterhouse next door. The smell, the noise, the trucks at 4 a.m. Suddenly your quiet residential street is a nightmare. This is exactly the problem that zoning laws were invented to solve. Zoning is the legal mechanism by which local governments divide land into designated districts and regulate what can be built and how land can be used within each district. Think of it as the rule book that keeps the slaughterhouse away from the kindergarten. For the AP exam, your core definition needs to be precise. Zoning is a form of land use regulation in which a municipality divides its territory into zones or districts, each with specific permitted uses, building specifications, and development standards. The authority to zone comes from a state's police power, the government's right to regulate for public health, safety, and welfare. This is a College Board favorite, so memorize that connection. The major zone types you must know. The AP exam expects you to recognize and distinguish the primary zoning categories. Residential zoning governs where people live and is often subdivided. Single-family residential zones, R1 permit, only detached homes on individual lots, while multifamily zones, R2, R3, and so on, allow apartments, duplexes, and condominiums. Commercial zoning designates areas for retail stores, offices, restaurants, and services. Industrial zoning sets aside land for manufacturing, warehousing, and heavy industry. And this is frequently broken into light industrial versus heavy industrial, a distinction that matters for MCQs. Agricultural zoning protects farmland from urban encroachment, and open space or conservation zoning preserves parks, wetlands, and green corridors. Here's an analogy that sticks. Think of a city as a layered cake. The residential layer sits on top. It's the most abundant and sensitive. The commercial layer runs through it like frosting at certain intersections. The industrial layer is the dense bottom layer, kept separate because of the heat and mess it generates. Zoning is the baker's decision about where each layer goes. Euclidean zoning and its legacy. The dominant form of zoning in American cities is called Euclidean zoning, named not for the Greek mathematician, but for the 1926 Supreme Court case, Village of Euclid v. Ambler Realty Co., which upheld the constitutionality of municipal zoning. Euclidean zoning is use-based and exclusionary by design. It physically separates land uses into distinct, largely incompatible zones. This has massive implications you need to connect to other units. Euclidean zoning is one of the key structural forces behind urban sprawl because separating residential from commercial means people must drive between them, incentivizing low-density suburban development. When an FRQ asks you to explain the causes of suburbanization or sprawl, zoning laws belong in your answer. A critical MCQ trap here, students often confuse Euclidean zoning with a general concept of grid-based planning. Be precise, Euclidean zoning is specifically about use separation, not street layout. Special zoning instruments you must recognize. Beyond the basic categories, several specific tools appear on the exam. Exclusionary zoning refers to regulations that, intentionally or not, exclude certain populations, typically lower income or minority residents, from a neighborhood. Large minimum lot sizes, prohibitions on multifamily housing, and requirements for large setbacks all serve this function. This connects directly to AP Human Geography's Unit 6 discussions of residential segregation, redlining, and socioeconomic inequality in cities. Inclusionary zoning is the reform-minded counterpart. It requires or incentivizes developers to include a percentage of affordable units in new residential developments. Some cities mandate that 10 to 20% of units in a new apartment complex be priced below market rate. This is a concept the AP exam may ask you to compare with exclusionary zoning, so know both sides of that coin. Mixed-use zoning is a more recent approach that deliberately allows or requires a combination of residential, commercial, and sometimes light industrial uses within the same zone or even the same building. A neighborhood where you can live above a coffee shop, walk to a grocery store, and catch a bus to work. That's a mixed-use zone. The AP exam connects this to new urbanism and smart growth movements, which you'll encounter when discussing sustainable urban development. Mixed-use zoning is essentially a deliberate rejection of Euclidean zoning separation logic. Spot zoning is when a single parcel is rezoned differently from its surrounding area, often to benefit one developer or owner. It's generally disfavored legally and raises equity concerns, and it's an MCQ favorite because students confuse it with mixed-use zoning. The key difference: spot zoning is irregular, ad hoc, and often controversial, while mixed-use zoning is a planned, systematic policy. Land use regulations beyond zoning. Zoning is the biggest tool, but the AP exam also expects you to know related instruments. Building codes set construction standards. Fire safety, structural integrity, electrical systems, setback requirements dictate how far a structure must sit from property lines, roads, or waterways. Floor area ratio FAR is a calculation you need to understand. It's the total floor area of a building divided by the area of the lot. A FAR of 2.0 means you can build twice the square footage of the lot, achieved either by building 2 stories over the entire lot or 4 stories over half the lot. High FARs encourage density, low FARs encourage sprawl. This is the closest thing to a formula in this section, and the AP exam can absolutely test your understanding of it conceptually. Eminent domain is the government's power to take private land for public use, with just compensation, a concept that intersects with zoning when municipalities acquire land to build roads, schools, or parks. Variances are official exceptions granted to property owners who face unique hardship under existing zoning rules. Understanding variances matters because they reveal how zoning systems handle edge cases. They're the safety valve in an otherwise rigid system. Connecting to urban models and other units. This topic threads through the entire urban unit. Zoning laws shape the patterns you see in the concentric zone model, the sector model, and the multiple nuclei model. In each case, the spatial separation of land uses is not accidental, it's legally enforced. When you're analyzing why industrial land clusters near rail lines or why wealthy residential zones occupy the urban fringe, zoning regulations are part of the mechanism. Looking beyond Unit 6, zoning also connects to Unit 7's discussion of development, resource distribution, and environmental sustainability, since agricultural and conservation zoning directly affect land availability and food systems. One final trap to avoid on exam day: students often assume zoning is purely a national policy. In the United States, zoning authority is almost entirely local. It belongs to cities, counties, and municipalities, not the federal government. If an MCQ or FRQ asks about the scale at which zoning decisions are made, your answer is local government. With a firm grasp of zoning structure and power, you're perfectly positioned to explore how urban planning goes beyond regulation into active design, which is exactly what we'll look at as we examine urban renewal, gentrification, and the redevelopment of city centers. 620 Census definitions: urban areas, metropolitan statistical areas (MSAs), and micropolitan areas. Why the Census Bureau draws lines and why you should care. Imagine you're an urban planner trying to figure out where to build a new highway, or a senator trying to decide how many federal dollars your district deserves for public transit. Before you can answer either of those questions, you need to answer a more fundamental one: what exactly counts as a city? That's not a philosophical question, it's a bureaucratic one, and the U.S. Census Bureau has very specific answers. For the AP exam, you need to know those answers cold, because the College Board loves testing whether students understand the official definitions versus their everyday assumptions about what urban means. Let's start with the foundational concept. An urban area, as defined by the Census Bureau, is not simply a place with a lot of people. The Census Bureau defines an urban area as a densely settled core of census tracts or blocks with a population of at least 2,500 people. That threshold surprises most students. 2,500 is a small town by most people's intuitions, but the Census Bureau is deliberately inclusive here. Everything that does not meet this threshold is classified as rural. Notice the binary, urban or rural. There's no official in-between category in the basic urban-rural split. This is your first potential MCQ trap. Students sometimes think suburban is an official Census Bureau category at this definitional level. It is not. Suburbs fall within the broader urban classification system, not outside it. Urban areas versus metropolitan statistical areas. Don't mix these up. Here's where most students stumble, and where the AP exam is most likely to separate the 4S from the 5S. An urban area and a metropolitan statistical area, MSA, are not the same thing. Think of an urban area as describing the physical continuous blob of dense settlement, the built-up fabric of streets, buildings, and people. An MSA, by contrast, is a functional economic region defined around a core city and the surrounding counties that are socially and economically integrated with it. The formal definition is precise. An MSA is a core urban area with a population of at least 50,000 people, together with adjacent counties that have strong commuting ties to that core. Strong commuting ties is usually measured as 25% or more of workers commuting to the central county. That commuting criterion is crucial. It reflects the concept of functional regions you studied back in Unit 1. An MSA isn't just about where people sleep. It's about where they work, shop, and live their economic lives. Think of it like a solar system. The central city is the sun, and the surrounding counties are orbiting planets, gravitationally bound by the daily movement of workers. A real-world example makes this click. When geographers talk about the Boston MSA, they don't just mean the city of Boston. They mean Boston plus dozens of surrounding cities and towns across eastern Massachusetts and even into southern New Hampshire, because workers in those areas are functionally tied to the Boston economy. The political boundary of Boston, Massachusetts, is far smaller than the Boston MSA. Micropolitan statistical areas, the smaller sibling. Now here's a definition students often forget entirely, and the exam will test it. A micropolitan statistical area follows the same structural logic as an MSA, but applies to smaller cities. A micropolitan area has a core urban cluster of at least 10,000 but fewer than 50,000 people, plus adjacent counties with strong commuting ties. Think of a regional hub like Hays, Kansas, or Minot, North Dakota, cities that dominate their surrounding rural landscape economically without reaching the scale of a true metropolitan area. The prefix micro is your memory hook. Smaller scale, same functional logic. The combined category that includes both MSAs and micropolitan areas is called a core-based statistical area, CBSA. You may see this term on the exam, and you should recognize it as the umbrella term. When a question says CBSA, it's asking about the whole system of metro and micro areas together. The edge cases that trip students up on multiple-choice questions. The College Board loves boundary conditions. Here are the ones you must internalize. First, counties, not cities, are the building blocks of MSAs outside of New England. In New England, because counties are less administratively meaningful, the Census Bureau uses towns and cities as the building blocks instead. This is a classic MCQ distractor. The answer counties is correct for most of the country, but not for New England. Second, a single MSA can span multiple states. The New York MSA includes parts of New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Knowing that MSAs are defined by economic integration, not political boundaries, is the conceptual key here. Third, don't confuse an MSA with a combined statistical area, CSA, which forms when two or more adjacent MSAs or micropolitan areas are themselves linked by commuting ties. The New York and Newark MSAs, for instance, combine into a massive CSA. The CSA is the widest, loosest definition. The MSA is the core functional unit. Connecting to the bigger picture. These definitions aren't just bureaucratic trivia. They connect directly to other concepts across Unit 6 and beyond. When you study suburbanization, you're really studying the physical expansion of urban areas and the geographic growth of MSAs over time as people move outward but remain economically connected to the urban core. The concepts of edge cities and exurbs represent the outermost counties that may eventually get absorbed into an MSA as commuting patterns shift. In Unit 7 on Industrial and Economic Geography, MSA population data drives decisions about market size, labor pools, and firm location, all concepts tied to agglomeration economies. And in Unit 2, when you discussed population distribution, the urban-rural distinction is precisely the Census Bureau's binary you learned here. For FRQ responses, be ready to explain, not just name these definitions. A rubric point is almost never awarded for simply writing MSA without explaining that it's a functional region defined by commuting ties to a core city of at least 50,000 people. Precision of language earns points. Vague paraphrasing does not. With these census definitions firmly in your toolkit, You're now perfectly positioned to explore how urban areas actually grow and change shape over time, which is exactly what we'll dig into when we examine models of urban structure and the forces of suburbanization that have reshaped American cities since the mid-20th century. 6.21 Bid Rent Theory and Urban Land Values. The core idea: why location determines price. Imagine you're at an auction and the item up for bid is a plot of land, right in the heart of downtown, next to the train station, surrounded by millions of potential customers and workers. How much would a retailer pay for that? Now imagine the same auction, but the land is 20 miles out on the suburban fringe. Same size plot, but the retailer would offer far less, because foot traffic drops, accessibility shrinks, and the value of being there versus out there is completely different. That intuition is exactly what bid-rent theory formalizes, and it is one of the most tested concepts in Unit 6. Bid-rent theory, developed by economist William Alonzo in the 1960s, explains how land values and land use change as you move outward from the central business district, or CBD. The central argument is elegantly simple. Different land users, retailers, offices, manufacturers, residents, are willing to pay different amounts for land depending on how much they benefit from proximity to the CBD. Each user has a bid-rent curve, which is a downward sloping line showing how much that user is willing to pay for land at each distance from the center. The closer to the CBD, the higher the bid. The farther away, the lower the bid. Land ultimately goes to the highest bidder at each location, and the result is a predictable pattern of land use rings emanating outward from the city center. Drawing and interpreting the bid-rent graph. You absolutely must be able to draw this graph from memory. Here's how to build it. Put distance from the CBD on the horizontal x-axis, running from zero outward. Put land rent or land value measured in dollars per unit area on the vertical y-axis. Now draw 3 downward sloping curves, each starting at a different height on the y-axis and declining at different rates. The steepest, highest curve represents retail and commercial users. They start with the highest willingness to pay near the CBD because they depend most heavily on accessibility, foot traffic, and visibility. Their curve drops off sharply because the value of a downtown retail location collapses quickly once you're even a mile or two out. The second curve, less steep and starting at a lower initial value, represents offices and industrial users. They still benefit from centrality being near workers, clients, and infrastructure, but they're less dependent on pure pedestrian traffic, so their curve declines more gradually. The third curve, the flattest and lowest, represents residential users. Households value accessibility too, but they're far more willing to trade distance for space and affordability, so their curve is the shallowest of the 3. The critical feature of the graph is where these curves intersect. The intersection between the retail curve and the office curve marks the boundary where land use transitions from commercial retail to office and industrial. The intersection between the office curve and the residential curve marks where industrial land gives way to residential neighborhoods. The outermost area where even the residential curve has fallen to a very low level becomes agricultural or undeveloped land. What you've essentially drawn is a graphic explanation of concentric zone theory, which connects directly back to section 6.4 when you studied urban land use models. Alonzo's bid-rent theory provides the economic mechanism behind those rings. The 3 users and their decision rules. For the AP exam, you need to remember not just who the 3 users are, but why their curves have the shapes they do. Retailers have the steepest decline because their revenue is most sensitive to location. Move a store away from downtown foot traffic, and sales can fall dramatically. This makes the slope of their bid-rent curve very steep. Office and industrial users have intermediate slopes because they care about labor access and transportation infrastructure, but they can function reasonably well at moderate distances. Residential users have the flattest curve because people are willing to commute, and the inconvenience of distance can be compensated by lower rents and larger homes. The decision rule embedded in the model is this: at any given location, the land use with the highest bid-rent curve wins that land. Land always goes to its highest valued use in a competitive market. This is not a choice, it's a market outcome. Edge cases and MCQ traps. Here's where students lose points. The first trap is confusing the slope of the bid-rent curve with the initial value at the CBD. Retail starts highest and falls fastest. Don't assume that because residential starts lower, it must also fall more steeply. It's actually the opposite. Residential is lowest and flattest. The second trap involves understanding what happens when the curves shift. If transportation infrastructure improves, say a new highway or subway line extends out of the city, the bid-rent curves for all users flatten out. Accessibility has been extended outward, so users are willing to pay more for land farther from the CBD than before. This causes suburbanization and urban sprawl, which ties directly into your Unit 6 discussions of edge cities and suburban growth. Conversely, if a CBD becomes less desirable due to crime, decline, or deindustrialization, the retail curve's starting value drops and the land use boundaries shift inward. The third trap is applying this model too rigidly. In reality, zoning laws, historical land uses, geographic barriers like rivers or hills, and racial and economic segregation all distort the clean theoretical rings. The AP exam will sometimes give you a scenario where bid-rent theory predicts one outcome, but real-world patterns differ. You need to explain what factors are causing that deviation. This connects to your Unit 6 work on the multiple nuclei model and the sector model, both of which emerged partly because the concentric zone model was too simple. Connections across the course. Bid-rent theory doesn't live in isolation. When you studied von Thunen's agricultural land use model in Unit 5, where different crops form rings around a market town based on transportation costs, you were looking at the agricultural ancestor of the very same idea. Alonso adapted that rural logic to urban land markets, recognizing that parallel on an FRQ can earn you synthesis points. Additionally, when you discuss gentrification, urban renewal, or the rise of edge cities, bid-rent theory explains the underlying economic pressure. As CBD land values rise, lower bid users get displaced outward, reshaping the urban landscape. On FRQs, if you're asked to explain why certain land uses cluster near the CBD, don't just say it's convenient, use the precise language. Higher bid users outcompete lower bid users for central locations because proximity to the CBD generates greater revenue or productivity for those users, driving up their willingness to pay. That level of precision is what earns full rubric credit. With bid-rent theory giving you the economic engine behind urban spatial patterns, you're now perfectly positioned to explore how those patterns have evolved over time. And in the next section, you'll examine the specific models geographers have built to describe and predict the shape of modern cities. 6.22. The CBD, Functions, Characteristics, and Changing Role. What the CBD actually is, picture the most recognizable part of any major American city. The cluster of skyscrapers you see in a movie establishing shot. The place where suits and taxis and coffee shops all converge on a Tuesday morning. That's the Central Business District, or CBD, and understanding it deeply is one of the most rewarding things you can do for your AP Human Geography score, because the CBD sits at the heart of nearly every urban model you've already studied. The CBD is the nucleus of urban commercial and professional activity. It's characterized by the highest land values in the entire metropolitan area, the greatest density of employment, the tallest buildings, and critically for the exam, the highest degree of accessibility. That word accessibility is doing a lot of work. The CBD exists because it is the most reachable point in the city, historically where transportation networks converged, and that accessibility is precisely why land values there are so astronomical. High land values drive vertical development, hence the skyline, and vertical development means the CBD packs an enormous amount of economic activity into a relatively small geographic footprint. Functions and characteristics you must know. The CBD performs several specialized functions that you need to be able to identify and explain on both multiple choice and free response questions. It serves as the center of retail activity, especially high-order goods and comparison shopping, professional and business services, law firms, financial institutions, corporate headquarters, government and civic functions, and cultural amenities like theaters, museums, and hotels. One of the most commonly tested characteristics is that the CBD has a very low residential population, especially at night. During the day, it pulses with hundreds of thousands of workers. After 5 o'clock, it empties. This is called the daytime versus nighttime population differential, and it's a trap the AP exam loves. Don't confuse high daytime activity with high residential density. The CBD is one of the least residentially dense zones in the urban area on a per square kilometer basis. Another key characteristic is the near total absence of manufacturing and heavy industry. Those land uses require large, flat, cheap parcels, the exact opposite of what the CBD offers. Industrial activity was pushed out long ago by the logic of the rent gradient, which you should remember from your urban models. Land value decreases as you move outward from the CBD, and each land use occupies the zone where it can afford to be and still turn a profit. This is the core logic of the Burgess concentric zone model, where the CBD sits at the very center, surrounded outward by the zone of transition, working-class housing, middle-class housing, and the commuter zone. Always be ready to connect CBD characteristics back to that model on the FRQ. The changing role of the CBD. Here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where the AP exam has shifted its focus in recent years. The CBD is not static. It has experienced dramatic transformation over the past several decades, And understanding why is essential for earning full points on FRQs. Starting in the mid-20th century, American CBDs entered a period of significant decline. Suburbanization pulled middle-class residents outward, and retail followed them to the edge cities and suburban malls. Deindustrialization hollowed out nearby transitional zones. White flight and disinvestment left many CBDs with high vacancy rates, deteriorating infrastructure, and growing poverty concentrations. This is a process directly tied to concepts from Unit 6, suburbanization, counter-urbanization, and the development of edge cities as competing commercial nodes. You should be able to explain that the CBD's decline was not accidental, but was driven by structural forces: automobile dependency, federal highway investment, discriminatory lending, redlining, and the economics of cheap suburban land. But the story doesn't end there. Since the 1990s and accelerating into the 2000s and 2010s, many CBDs have experienced a powerful reversal through gentrification and urban revitalization. Young professionals, especially millennials, have returned to city centers, drawn by walkability, cultural amenities, and proximity to employment. Cities have invested in sports stadiums, convention centers, waterfront redevelopment, and arts districts to catalyze this return. This is the concept of urban reinvestment or downtown revitalization, and it connects directly to gentrification processes you've studied. The AP exam frequently asks you to identify the consequences of this revitalization: rising property values, displacement of lower-income residents, conversion of former industrial spaces to loft apartments and restaurants, and the tension between economic growth and social equity. Models, diagrams, and the exam. When you're asked to draw or interpret an urban model showing the CBD, remember these non-negotiables. In the Burgess concentric zone model, the CBD is zone I, a small central circle. In the Hoyt sector model, it still occupies the center, but sectors of different land uses radiate outward from it. In the multiple nuclei model, the CBD is one of several nodes, which is the entire point of that model. It recognizes that not all activity concentrates in a single center. The Latin American city model places the CBD alongside a commercial spine that extends outward, reflecting a different cultural and economic history of urban development. If an FRQ asks you to describe differences between models, the CBD's role and dominance is one of the clearest points of contrast. Traps to avoid. A few MCQ traps appear with real consistency here. First, don't confuse the CBD with the zone of transition. They are adjacent but distinct. The zone of transition, Zone 2 in Burgess, is characterized by mixed land uses, poverty, and often immigrant communities, while the CBD itself is defined by commercial and professional dominance. Second, remember that edge cities and suburban commercial centers are competitors to the CBD, not parts of it. Third, the question of whether CBDs are declining or revitalizing depends heavily on context. Large global cities like New York and Chicago have seen robust revitalization, while many mid-sized Rust Belt cities continue to struggle. The AP exam may ask you to apply concepts to specific regional context, so be precise rather than making blanket generalizations. Finally, connect the CBD to the concept of bid-rent theory. The reason the CBD looks the way it does, those towers, that density, those specific functions, is because the bid-rent curve for commercial and office uses peaks at the city center. Retailers and offices can outbid everyone else for that central land, and every other land use sorts itself outward accordingly. If you can explain bid-rent theory in an FRQ, you've demonstrated a conceptual mastery of why the CBD exists, not just what it contains, and that is exactly the depth of understanding that earns top scores. With the CBD firmly in your mental map, you're perfectly positioned to zoom out and examine how urban structure has been reshaped beyond the traditional core. Because next we'll look at how suburbs, edge cities, and sprawl have fundamentally reorganized metropolitan areas in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. 6.23. Applying and critiquing urban models, limitations, and real-world fit. Why models are always wrong and still useful. Here's something your professor wants you to sit with for a moment. Every urban model you've learned in this unit is wrong. Not a little wrong, fundamentally, structurally wrong, in ways that real cities expose immediately. And yet the AP exam expects you to know them cold, apply them accurately, and this is the part most students miss, critique them with precision. So let's talk about what it means to apply a model and what it means to honestly evaluate its limitations, because both skills show up on your FRQ scoring rubrics. Think of urban models like a weather forecast. The forecast is never perfectly right, but it's still incredibly useful. A meteorologist who says 70% chance of rain tomorrow isn't lying when it stays sunny. They're modeling a complex system with imperfect information. Urban geographers do the same thing. Burgess, Hoyt, Harris, and Ullman, and the others gave us tools for thinking, not photographs of reality. The AP exam tests whether you understand that distinction. The classic models and their built-in assumptions. Let's revisit the core models quickly, because the critique only makes sense if you remember what each model assumed in the first place. The concentric zone model, Burgess, 1925, was built on Chicago, a relatively flat Midwestern city growing outward from a lakefront CBD in the early industrial era. It assumes flat terrain, a single dominant center, and a city shaped by industrialization and immigration. The moment you leave that specific historical and geographic context, the model starts to crack. Ask yourself, does the concentric zone model describe Mumbai, Lagos, Los Angeles? The answer is emphatically no, and explaining why is exactly the kind of analytical thinking the FRQ rewards. The sector model, Hoyt, 1939, improved on Burgess by acknowledging that cities grow along transportation corridors. Think highways and rail lines creating wedge-shaped sectors rather than neat rings. But Hoyt also studied American cities, mostly in the industrial North and Midwest, and his model still assumes a single CBD at the center. It handles linear transportation better than Burgess, but it still struggles with polycentric cities, cities with multiple downtowns, which is increasingly how most large modern cities actually function. The multiple nuclei model, Harris and Ullman, 1945, was already a critique of the previous two, by arguing that cities develop around multiple nodes, an airport, a university, a suburban mall, a port. Harris and Ullman were essentially saying Burgess and Hoyt oversimplified. But here's your MCQ trap. Students often assume the multiple nuclei model is the best model because it came last. The exam will test whether you understand that it's also limited. It's descriptive rather than predictive. It doesn't tell you where nuclei will form or why, and it was still built on the American urban experience. The Latin American and Southeast Asian urban models. Different contexts, different structures. This is where the AP exam gets serious about critiquing Western-centric models. The Griffin-Ford model of Latin American cities flips the concentric zone logic almost inside out. Instead of wealthy residents pushing to the suburbs, elites live closest to the CBD in a high-quality spine of development radiating outward, while the poorest residents occupy the peripheral squatter settlements called colonias or barrios at the urban edge. If you applied Burgess to Mexico City and expected wealthier residents in the outer zones, you'd be completely wrong. The Latin American model exists precisely because the concentric zone model failed to explain what geographers actually observe. Similarly, the McGee model of Southeast Asian cities, sometimes called the Dakota model, describes a very different urban form shaped by wet rice agriculture, colonial port histories, and densely interwoven urban-rural zones. The term Dakota, from the Indonesian words for village and city, describes those mixed-use corridors between large cities where agriculture and industry exist side by side. This model challenges the clean separation of urban and rural that all the Western models assume. The critical framework, how to evaluate any model on the exam. When an FRQ asks you to evaluate the applicability of an urban model, you need a mental checklist. First, identify what the model was designed to explain and where it was built. Second, compare those original conditions to the case you're given. Third, explain specifically what the model gets right and what it gets wrong, using geographic vocabulary. The scoring rubric will almost always reward you for being specific. Not just the model doesn't fit, but the model doesn't fit because it assumes a monocentric city. While City X has developed multiple commercial nuclei as a result of polycentric suburban growth, common limitations to have at your fingertips include all the classic Western models were built on North American or European cities and reflect those specific economic, historical, and racial contexts. They assume relatively free market land use, so they fail in cities where government controls land allocation. Think socialist cities in the former Soviet Union, or Singapore's government-planned housing. They were developed during specific historical periods and don't account for post-industrial deindustrialization, the rise of edge cities, or digital economy land use patterns, and they treat cities as static snapshots rather than dynamic, changing systems. Edge cases and MCQ traps to watch for. The exam loves to give you a city description and ask which model best fits, and then offer a distractor that seems close but misses a key detail. Watch for questions about cities where the poor live in the city center and the wealthy live on the periphery. That's your cue for the Latin American model, not Burgess. Watch for questions describing elongated, wedge-shaped development along a highway. That's Hoyt's sector model, not concentric zones. And watch for questions about multiple CBDs or nodes. That's multiple nuclei, but don't claim it predicts where those nodes will form, because it doesn't. One more trap. The exam sometimes asks whether a model is useful, even if it doesn't perfectly describe a city. The correct answer is almost always yes. Models are analytical frameworks, not blueprints, but you need to qualify that usefulness with a specific critique. Saying a model is useful because it helps us think about urban structure won't score points. Saying it's useful because it correctly identifies the role of transportation in shaping land use, even if it underestimates polycentric development, will. Connecting to the rest of the course. This topic threads through almost every other part of AP Human Geography. The critiques of urban models connect directly to Unit 4's discussions of colonialism and development, because many non-Western city forms reflect colonial histories rather than free market growth. They connect to Unit 5's discussions of agricultural systems, especially through the Dakota model's blurring of urban and rural. And they connect forward to everything in Unit 7 about industrialization and economic development, because the shape of a city reflects the economic forces that built it. Understanding that models are tools, powerful, imperfect, culturally situated tools, is one of the most mature analytical moves you can make on this exam, and it's exactly the kind of thinking that separates a 3 from a 5. With that critical lens now sharpened, let's turn to how urban planning policies have attempted to address the very problems these models helped us identify. 6.24 Housing Discrimination, Segregation, and Fair Housing Policy. The neighborhood that never was. Imagine you've saved up enough money to buy your first home. You walk into a bank, you've got good credit, a steady job, and a down payment ready to go. But the loan officer looks at the address you've circled on a map, a neighborhood on the east side of town, and suddenly the interest rate climbs or the loan just doesn't come through. Maybe the real estate agent keeps steering you toward a different part of town. Maybe the seller won't take your offer. None of it is written down anywhere, none of it is technically official, but the effect is unmistakable. You cannot live where you want to live. This is the world that millions of Americans, particularly Black, Latino, and immigrant communities, navigated throughout the 20th century and in subtler forms still navigate today. For the AP exam, understanding housing discrimination, segregation, and fair housing policy means being able to connect the physical patterns of cities to the social and political forces that created them. Let's build that understanding layer by layer. Redlining and the OLLC maps. The concept you absolutely must know is redlining. In the 1930s, the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation, the OOLC, created color-coded maps of cities across the United States. Neighborhoods were graded A through D. A neighborhoods, outlined in green, were considered the best investments, new, homogeneous meaning white, and desirable. D neighborhoods were outlined in red, hence redlining, and were deemed too risky for mortgage investment. These were almost invariably neighborhoods where Black Americans, immigrants, and working-class families lived. Here's the critical geographic consequence. Banks and federal mortgage programs used these maps to deny loans in redlined areas. No loans meant no home purchases. No home purchases meant no wealth accumulation through property. No wealth accumulation meant those neighborhoods deteriorated, while green zone suburbs exploded with investment. The spatial inequality baked into those 1930s maps is still visible in income, health, and educational outcomes across American cities today. When the AP exam asks you to explain why certain urban neighborhoods have experienced long-term disinvestment, redlining is a foundational answer. Blockbusting and white flight. Connected to redlining is a practice called blockbusting, and this one has a storytelling quality that makes it easy to remember. Real estate agents, motivated by profit, would deliberately introduce one or two Black families into a previously all-white neighborhood. They'd then approach white homeowners and whisper warnings. Property values are going to fall. You should sell now while you still can. Panicked white residents would sell quickly and cheaply. The agents would then resell those homes to Black families at inflated prices. The neighborhood would turn over racially, and the agent pocketed the spread on both transactions. Blockbusting accelerated white flight, the large-scale movement of white residents from urban neighborhoods to suburbs throughout the mid-20th century. This is directly connected to suburbanization, which you covered in earlier sections of Unit 6, and to the growth of the urban-suburban divide in terms of tax base, school funding, and infrastructure investment. The AP exam loves to ask how white flight connects to fiscal stress in cities. Remember that as white, middle-class residents left, they took their tax dollars with them, which hollowed out urban municipal budgets, racial covenants, and exclusionary zoning. Before blockbusting, there was an even more formal mechanism. Racial covenants, also called restrictive covenants. These were clauses written directly into property deeds stating that the home could never be sold to a person of a specific race or religion. They were widespread, they were legal, and they were devastating. The Supreme Court ruled them unenforceable in Shelley v. Kramer in 1948, but they stayed written in deeds for decades afterward. Closely related is exclusionary zoning, which you should connect to your Unit 6 land use knowledge. When cities zone entire areas for single-family homes on large lots, they effectively price out lower-income residents, who are disproportionately people of color, from those neighborhoods. Exclusionary zoning is a structural form of segregation that doesn't mention race explicitly, but produces racially and economically homogeneous neighborhoods. On the MCQ, if you see a question about modern mechanisms that perpetuate segregation without explicit racial language, exclusionary zoning is your answer. The Fair Housing Act of 1968. The legislative turning point is the Fair Housing Act of 1968, passed just days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. This law made it illegal to discriminate in the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, or religion. Later amendments in 1988 extended protections to people with disabilities and families with children. For the AP exam, know what the Fair Housing Act prohibits: steering, directing buyers toward or away from neighborhoods based on race, discriminatory lending practices, and refusal to sell or rent based on protected characteristics. Know that enforcement has historically been weak and that de facto segregation that exists in practice without legal mandate, persists even after de jure segregation by law, was ended. This de jure versus de facto distinction is a classic AP exam trap. Students often assume that because legal discrimination was outlawed, segregation ended. It did not. The patterns created by decades of redlining, blockbusting, and restrictive covenants were already spatially embedded. You cannot undo 50 years of disinvestment with a single law. Reading segregation on a map. If the AP exam gives you a map showing the racial or economic distribution of a metropolitan area, here is how to read it with precision. Concentrated poverty in inner-ring neighborhoods combined with affluent, racially homogeneous suburbs is the classic signature of 20th century housing discrimination. You should also know the index of dissimilarity, which measures residential segregation on a scale from 0, perfectly integrated, to 100, perfectly segregated. A score of 60 or above indicates very high segregation. The AP exam may describe this concept without using the specific term, asking you to evaluate how evenly distributed groups are across a metro area. Connections across the course. This topic threads through nearly every other concept in Unit 6. Segregation shapes the concentric zone model and the sector model. The patterns those models describe are not random. They were engineered by discriminatory policy. Housing discrimination connects to urban renewal, which often demolish black neighborhoods under the euphemism of slum clearance, to gentrification, which can displace the communities that remained, and to infrastructure inequality in Unit 6's broader discussions of urban planning. Stepping back further, it connects to Unit 4's discussions of political geography. Gerrymandering often follows the residential segregation lines created by these very policies. The takeaway for your exam is this: when you see urban spatial patterns, ask who created them, how, and why. The answers almost always run through the history of housing discrimination. Coming up next, we'll examine how urban planners and policymakers have attempted to reshape cities through smart growth strategies and new urbanism, efforts that in many ways are a direct response to the fragmented, inequitable urban landscapes that housing discrimination left behind. 6.25 Urban Heat Islands and Environmental Justice in Cities. Let's talk about something you've almost certainly experienced without realizing it had a name. Think about the last time you drove from the suburbs into a city on a hot summer day. Maybe you noticed the air felt heavier, thicker, almost pressing down on you as you got closer to downtown. That sensation is real, measurable, and has enormous consequences for millions of people, and it has a name: the Urban Heat Island Effect. What is an urban heat island? An urban heat island, UAI, is the phenomenon where urban areas experience significantly higher temperatures than surrounding rural areas, primarily because human-modified surfaces absorb and retain more heat than natural landscapes. The College Board wants you to understand both the cause and the consequence here. Cities replace vegetation and permeable soils with concrete, asphalt, glass, and steel. Natural surfaces absorb some solar radiation and release the rest through evapotranspiration. Essentially, trees and soil sweat, cooling the air around them. But asphalt doesn't sweat. It absorbs solar radiation all day and radiates that heat back slowly through the night, keeping cities warmer even after sunset. Imagine the difference between wearing a dark wool sweater versus a white linen shirt on a sunny afternoon. The city is the wool sweater. It holds everything in. The surrounding countryside is the linen shirt, light, breathable, releasing heat efficiently. That analogy will serve you well on the exam. For the AP exam, you need to be able to describe and interpret the urban heat island profile graph. Picture a cross-sectional diagram, a horizontal axis representing distance from rural land through suburbs to the urban core, and then back out the other side. The vertical axis shows temperature. The resulting line is not flat. It rises gradually as you move from rural areas into suburban zones, then climbs sharply as you enter the urban core, peaking in the densest downtown areas, often called the urban heat peak or heat dome. Then it dips back down as you move through suburban areas and return to rural land. This peaked profile is your signature UHI diagram. Be ready to label it: rural background temperature, suburban transition zone, urban peak, and the rural sink on the far side. The temperature difference between the rural background and the urban peak typically ranges from 1 to 7 degrees Celsius in most cities, though some large metros see even greater differentials. Causes and contributing factors. The causes of UHEs cluster into a few categories the exam loves to test. First, reduced vegetation and green space eliminates natural cooling through evapotranspiration. Second, impervious surfaces, roads, parking lots, rooftops absorb and re-emit heat. Third, urban geometry matters enormously. Tall buildings in dense cities create urban canyons where reflected heat bounces between structures and gets trapped rather than escaping into the atmosphere. Fourth, anthropogenic heat from vehicles, air conditioners, industrial processes, and human metabolism itself adds thermal energy directly into the urban environment. Notice the cruel irony here. The hotter a city gets, the more people run air conditioners, which pump heat out of buildings and into the street, making the city even hotter. That feedback loop is a classic AP exam connection point. Environmental justice and the UHI. Here's where this topic gets both morally complex and exam critical. The UHI effect does not burden all urban residents equally, and the College Board explicitly frames this through the lens of environmental justice, the principle that all communities, regardless of race, income, or national origin, deserve equal protection from environmental hazards and equal access to environmental benefit. Research consistently shows that lower-income neighborhoods and communities of color within cities experience more intense urban heat island effects than wealthier, whiter neighborhoods in the same city. Why? Because historically, redlining and discriminatory housing policies pushed marginalized communities into industrial zones, near highways, and away from parks. These neighborhoods were built with less tree canopy, more impervious surface, and more industrial land use. A wealthy neighborhood might have tree-lined streets, parks, and newer buildings with better insulation. A lower-income neighborhood a few miles away might have almost no tree cover, older housing stock with poor ventilation, and proximity to heat-generating infrastructure. Both neighborhoods sit inside the same city, but they experience meaningfully different temperatures on a July afternoon. For the FRQ, this is a high-value scoring area. If a prompt asks you to explain disparities in urban heat exposure, you need to connect three things explicitly: the physical geography of heat, impervious surfaces, lack of vegetation; the historical and political geography of housing discrimination, redlining, exclusionary zoning; and the present-day public health consequences: heat-related illness, mortality during heat waves, higher energy costs. The rubric rewards you for making those connections explicit, not just gesturing at them. Mitigation strategies. You also need to know the suite of UHI mitigation strategies that urban planners deploy. Green roofs replace conventional rooftops with vegetation that provides insulation and evapotranspiration cooling. Urban tree canopy expansion, planting street trees, and maintaining parks directly counteracts heat through shade and transpiration. Cool pavement and cool roofs use reflective materials to bounce solar radiation away rather than absorbing it. The technical term for this reflectivity is albedo, and higher albedo surfaces stay cooler. Expanding urban parks and blue spaces, ponds, fountains, permeable paving that allows water infiltration. Add cooling capacity throughout the urban fabric. Smart urban planning also means protecting existing green space from development pressure and ensuring new green infrastructure is distributed equitably, not just placed in already affluent neighborhoods. Common MCQ traps and connections to other units. Watch out for these traps. First, students often confuse the urban heat island effect with global climate change. They are related but distinct phenomena. UHEs are local temperature anomalies caused by land use change. Climate change is a global shift in baseline temperatures. Both can worsen each other, but do not conflate them in an FRQ. Second, some questions will show you the UHI profile graph and ask which zone has the highest temperature. Always choose the densest urban core, not the industrial fringe, which might seem like it would be hottest, but is rarely the temperature peak. Third, do not assume that all urban neighborhoods experience the same UHI intensity. The environmental justice dimension requires you to think about intra-urban variation. The connections to other units are rich. From Unit 5, recall how agricultural land conversion to urban use reduces natural cooling through evapotranspiration. This is the same mechanism driving UHIS. From Unit 7, your understanding of centrifugal and centripetal forces in cities helps explain why some communities are pushed toward high-heat industrial zones. And from Unit 4, the legacy of colonialism and domestic policies like redlining produce the spatial inequalities that make environmental justice an ongoing urban challenge. Understanding urban heat, islands, and environmental justice gives you a powerful lens for reading cities, not just as economic or cultural landscapes, but as environments where physical geography and social inequality intersect in real, measurable ways. Next, we'll turn to how cities plan for sustainable development and the frameworks urban governments use to manage growth, including smart growth strategies and urban growth boundaries. 6.26 Global Cities and Deindustrialization, Economic Restructuring, and the Post-Industrial City. The big picture, from smokestacks to skylines. Let's start with a mental image. Picture Detroit in 1955, roaring assembly lines, thousands of workers clocking in and out of massive factories, entire neighborhoods built around the rhythm of the auto industry. Now picture Detroit in 2010, abandoned factories, crumbling neighborhoods, a city that had lost more than half its population. What happened? The answer is deindustrialization, and understanding it is absolutely central to everything the AP exam wants you to know about how modern cities work. Deindustrialization is the process by which manufacturing industry declines in a region or city, typically as production moves elsewhere, often to lower-wage countries, and the local economy shifts away from secondary sector manufacturing activities toward tertiary and quaternary sector activities like finance, healthcare, education, and technology. This isn't just an economic shift. It rewrites the geography of cities from the ground up. Economic restructuring and the post-industrial city. The term economic restructuring is your AP vocabulary anchor here. It refers to the large-scale transformation of a region's economy, usually involving the decline of one dominant sector and the rise of another. When manufacturing leaves, cities don't simply collapse, they restructure. Some do it successfully, others struggle for generations. The post-industrial city that emerges from this process looks very different from its industrial predecessor. Think about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In the 1970s, it was the steel city dependent almost entirely on steel production. When those mills closed, Pittsburgh could have become another Detroit. Instead, it restructured around healthcare. The UPMC system now employs more people than U.S. Steel ever did. Education, Carnegie Mellon, and the University of Pittsburgh became economic engines and technology. Pittsburgh is your go-to example of successful deindustrialization and economic restructuring, and it shows up on AP exams regularly. The AP exam also wants you to understand the role of the service sector transition more broadly. As manufacturing jobs leave, the jobs that replace them tend to be either high-skill and high-wage, finance, technology, management consulting, or low-skill and low-wage, retail, food service, hospitality. This polarization of the labor market is a key consequence of deindustrialization, and it directly connects to Unit 6's discussions of income inequality and urban poverty, so flag that connection in your mind. Global cities, the command and control centers. Now let's introduce the concept that ties everything together, the global city. A global city, sometimes called a world city, is a metropolis that serves as a major node in the global economic network, functioning as a command and control center for the global economy. The sociologist Saskia Sassen, whose work the College Board loves to reference, argued that global cities emerged precisely because of deindustrialization, as manufacturing dispersed globally. The headquarters, financial services, law firms, and advertising agencies that manage those dispersed production networks concentrated in a handful of elite cities. The classic examples you must know are New York, London, and Tokyo, often called the Big Three global cities. But the AP exam also expects you to recognize a broader hierarchy. Geographers John Friedman and Sassen both described a world city hierarchy, and you should be able to conceptualize it as a tiered structure. Alpha cities at the top, New York, London, Tokyo, Paris, Hong Kong, Singapore, Shanghai, then beta cities, then gamma cities, cascading down to ordinary cities with little global connectivity. Think of it like a corporate org chart for the entire planet. Information, capital, and decisions flow through these nodes. What makes a city global? On the exam, you need to articulate specific characteristics: a disproportionate concentration of producer services, banking, insurance, law, advertising, major international transportation hubs, headquarters of transnational corporations, large immigrant populations drawing from worldwide origins, significant cultural influence, and major stock or commodity exchanges. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain why a city functions as a global city, this is your checklist. Deindustrialization's landscape, what you see on the ground. Here's where the geography gets beautifully visible. Deindustrialization leaves physical marks on urban landscapes that the AP exam may ask you to interpret. Brownfields are former industrial sites that are often contaminated and sitting idle. They're a direct product of deindustrialization. When cities successfully restructure, brownfield redevelopment becomes a major planning tool. The transformation of London's Docklands into Canary Wharf, now one of Europe's premier financial districts, is the gold standard example of this process. Former industrial waterfront became gleaming office towers housing global banks. Gentrification is another process closely linked to post-industrial restructuring. As high-skill workers move into restructured cities, they often rehabilitate formerly industrial or working-class neighborhoods, driving up rents and displacing long-term residents. You've covered gentrification elsewhere in Unit 6, but understanding it through the lens of deindustrialization deepens your ability to analyze it on the exam. The question, what caused this neighborhood to gentrify, often has the answer. The post-industrial economy brought in a new class of workers who needed housing near downtown amenities. Common MCQ traps and FRQ pitfalls. Here are the traps the College Board loves to set. First, don't confuse deindustrialization with underdevelopment. Deindustrialization happens to already industrialized places. It's a phase that comes after industrialization, not instead of it. A common wrong answer will try to get you to apply deindustrialization to sub-Saharan Africa, but that's incorrect. Countries that never industrialized didn't deindustrialize. Second, watch for questions that conflate global cities with simply large cities. Population size alone does not make a global city. Mumbai has over 20 million people, but historically ranked lower in world city hierarchies than Singapore, which is much smaller because hierarchy is about economic connectivity, not population. Third, on FRQs, when you're asked about the consequences of deindustrialization, make sure you address spatial inequality explicitly. The College Board's rubrics reward students who connect economic processes to uneven geographic outcomes. Not just that jobs were lost, but that those job losses concentrated in specific neighborhoods, often lower-income communities of color, deepening patterns of segregation and disinvestment. Connecting the dots. This topic is a rich intersection point in the course. Deindustrialization connects backward to Unit 5's discussion of the Industrial Revolution and how industrial location patterns formed in the first place. It connects to Unit 7's discussion of development and globalization. The jobs that left Detroit and Pittsburgh often went to export processing zones in Mexico or Southeast Asia, directly linking to Wallerstein's world systems theory and the core periphery model. And within Unit 6, it connects forward to discussions of urban planning, housing policy, and the sustainable city. Because post-industrial cities face the specific challenge of managing the environmental legacy of their industrial past while building an equitable economic future. As you move forward, you'll find that understanding how global economic forces shape individual neighborhoods, one of the central tensions in the next topic, builds directly on everything we've unpacked here about restructuring, hierarchy, and the post-industrial landscape.